The morning sun rose over the endless plains as the troops advanced at a measured pace. At the head of the formation rode Prince Yuri Briol, his banner flying behind him, while the knights and soldiers marched in disciplined formation. Jard reported to Yuri that support for Balshad's detachment had been cut off. The prince showed no outward reaction to the news, and merely calmly inquired if this was true. Yuri noted the inevitability of the situation due to frequent attacks along the route. Jard agreed, adding that ensuring supplies had now become their primary concern. Yuri touched his chin thoughtfully, noting that even with the supplies he had prepared, the situation was worse than he had expected. Surveying the plains, he noted that they had reached the depths of the region. Okua's proximity meant their entire force could strike at any moment. He concluded that if the orcs intended to draw them into a war of attrition, they should have ended it before it reached that stage. At that moment, the earth shook. A powerful vibration passed beneath them, causing the horses to rear and tremble. Yuri nearly lost his balance. He gritted his teeth and pulled on the reins with all his might, until his horse calmed down. Without hesitation, he shouted for everyone to dismount, and he himself jumped to the ground. The warriors and knights knelt beside their horses. Jard asked if it was an earthquake, but Yuri firmly objected, noting that the nature of what was happening was quite different. He channeled mana into his palm and pressed it to the ground, his face tightening as realization dawned. Before this thought had time to fully take shape, the earth split, and something huge rushed upwards with force. As it rose, Yuri finally realized what was happening, realizing that something was emerging from underground. The structure took the form of an ancient watchtower, battered by time but still intact. It towered over the formation. After some time, Radna gathered several mages at a safe distance and instructed them to cast probing spells. Layers of magic washed over the ruin's exterior as they checked it. A voice called out to Radna from behind, and he turned, seeing Yuri approaching. Radna greeted him, and Yuri asked what these ruins were. Radna shook his head with a tired expression, clasping his hands behind his back, and said they had found no connection to the orcs. He explained that from the outside, it looked like ordinary ruins. He clicked his tongue and admitted that not being able to see inside seemed unnatural. Yuri smiled and suggested they check it out for themselves, bowing slightly and pressing his hand to his chest as he said that there was most likely something hidden inside. And considering how suddenly it appeared, he added that it would be best to see for himself. Radna agreed, after which he ordered Yuri to take the Imperial Knights with him. This order instantly extinguished Yuri's fleeting sense of satisfaction. Soon several people approached, addressed him as a prince, and reported that they had placed themselves under his command. The knight leading them introduced himself as Rodan, saying he was pleased to meet him and identifying himself as an Imperial Knight. Jard whispered to Yuri that he didn't want to go with Rodan's men. The prince replied just as quietly that he simply had no other choice. Yuri thought about how he should have obeyed, although he didn't expect Radna to send the Imperial Knights to him so directly. As he mounted his horse to lead the group, he hoped that Radna had no ulterior motives. They soon arrived at the front of the building and dismounted again. Yuri stood in front of a massive sealed door, with Jard on one side of him and Laurent on the other. He noticed that this must be the entrance, but noted that it didn't open. Jard suggested searching for mechanisms nearby, while Laurent kept his hand closer to the sword as Yuri took a step forward. Yuri pressed his palm to the door and said that everything was fine, explaining that he could break it a little if necessary. Even as he spoke, mana seeped out of him, flowing through his hand and sinking into the stone. He concentrated and pressed harder, gathering his strength to elicit a response. A measured vibration spread throughout the structure. Yuri's eyes widened as the sealed door began to shake and then slowly crawl upwards on its own. Everyone froze in place. Jard blurted out in disbelief, asking what Yuri had done, and Yuri honestly replied that he didn't know. He peered into the opening and thought he had barely touched it, but it opened too easily, as if the ruins themselves had been waiting for it. Yuri didn't rush forward. He carefully studied the darkness ahead, carefully considering everything. Then he stepped forward with Jard and Laurent and announced that they were heading inside. They moved down the corridor, their footsteps echoing softly off the stone. Someone muttered that it was too dark. Yuri stopped and called Jard by name, asking if he had brought torches. Jard replied that he had not. Yuri glanced back at the Imperial Knights and assumed that they had most likely also arrived without them. Turning back, he stopped. After all, I noticed an unlit lamp attached to the wall. Remembering how the door had reacted, he directed mana into the lamp. It instantly burst into flames. Yuri stared in shock as the light spread outward. Jard whispered to Yuri that he didn't want to go with Rodan's men. The prince replied just as quietly that he simply had no other choice. Yuri told them they were moving forward and ordered everyone to remain vigilant. Jard and Laurent agreed in unison. The Imperial Knights followed them silently, watching closely. Rodan studied Yuri with open suspicion, but said nothing. As they moved forward, Yuri's boot crunched on something hard. He looked down and saw a large bone. Ahead, the corridor opened into a more spacious hall, strewn with skulls and scattered remains. At the far end, leaning against another door, sat a human skeleton, clad in armor which unmistakably belonged to a knight. Everyone stopped. Yuri stared at the spectacle and started to comment on it, but Jard stepped forward and said he would check everything first. Having reached the skeleton, Jard called the prince, and then knocked on the door behind him and shouted back that the way from here was blocked. Yuri squatted down next to the remains, examining them carefully without touching them. He noticed that most of the bones belonged to orcs. While this skeleton was human, the evidence of a battle indicated that the knight had died defending the door. Jard shouted again, reporting that the door was unresponsive, even when mana was poured into it. Yuri looked up and said that there was nothing that could be done about it, adding that they should go back and see if they had missed anything earlier. Jard whispered to Yuri that he didn't want to go with Rodain's men. The prince replied just as quietly that he simply had no other choice. The next moment, the skeleton lunged forward and grabbed Yuri's arm tightly. Shock paralyzed Yuri, and Jard recoiled in panic. Light burst from the skeleton and flooded the room. Jard cried out in alarm, demanding to know what it was, and Laurent shouted Yuri's name. The Imperial Knights rushed forward, shouting orders as they closed the distance. The light intensified, turning into a misty glow, identical in color to Yuri's own aura. Yuri grunted, closed his eyes, and raised his free hand to protect himself from the blinding glare. Still holding him tightly, the skeleton spoke. Its voice echoed deep within Yuri, begging him to remember. The sound shook him to the core. Yuri opened his eyes and stared into the empty sockets as the voice echoed in his mind again, telling him that this was their salvation. In the blinding whiteness, Yuri's vision shattered into pieces. The world before his eyes turned upside down, replaced by an unfamiliar sky. A clean white stone structure towered beneath the bright light. It was unlike the ruins of old, and Yuri felt immersed in alien memories. Suddenly, a boy in a green cloak ran past him, calling his master to look. The older, broad-shouldered knight turned to him, crossing his arms over his chest, and demanded to know where the boy had gone. The boy grinned and explained what he was reading, clutching a thick volume to his chest. When Yuri looked at the knight's armor, he recognized it. This armor was on that skeleton. He wondered if he was witnessing a skeleton's memories. And I thought that leaving something like that behind must have required colossal magic. He watched as the boy slowed down and stopped next to his master, who asked if he had anything he wanted to tell him. The boy opened the book on the grass, its pages filled with dense text, circles, and diagrams. The master asked how the boy's studies were progressing. The boy fell silent. The master's patience had run out. He insisted on an answer and warned the boy not to change the subject. The boy dejectedly admitted that reading brought him no pleasure. The master asked if there was another way for him to become a good hunter. Yuri felt a strange pain from this dialogue, thinking that it reminded him of the old times when Bernard nagged him incessantly. Then the master told the boy to look carefully and put his hand into the bag. Taking out a jagged red crystal, where the light played like blood on glass, he called it the mark of an orc hunter and the condition for recognition as a full-fledged warrior. Yuri silently absorbed this explanation, thinking that it answered more questions than he would have liked. But the boy didn't look inspired. Instead, he spoke with disappointment, saying he didn't understand why they had to kill orcs, and assuming that negotiations should be possible. Silence followed. The master's gaze hardened, and he said that the boy himself had asked for the truth. He ordered him to listen carefully, and stated bluntly that the orcs, these are people corrupted by black magic. Yuri caught his breath, and he reacted in shock, demanding to know what it meant. The memory sank into a deeper darkness. The master declared that long ago, a power-obsessed nobleman had exterminated his people. The vision showed a throne rising above a sea of bloodied bodies. When a royal decree prohibited murder, a black magician came to a nobleman and perverted the law, arguing that the king had forbidden killing people, not turning people into something else. The nobleman rejoiced. A ritual chamber appeared, illuminated by a single red glow like an unblinking eye. The nobleman began to forcibly inject black magic into people, and those who came into contact with it turned into inhuman monsters, filled with hatred for humanity. The orcs known today, as the master explained, were humans corrupted by black magic. Yuri's eyes widened as the truth dawned on him. He said it meant the orcs he'd been killing were descended from humans. The boy asked if the black magician had been punished. The master replied that no, explaining that by the time the nobleman's crimes were dealt with, the magician had already disappeared. He added that no way to reverse the transformation had been found, and the kingdom had ultimately given up hope. The boy was left stunned. The master looked up to the sky and said that the hunters existed to take damned lives and grant them salvation in the form of peace. Yuri's thoughts sharpened as he wondered if the black magic he had once inherited was related to the power used by orc shamans and the human sacrifices the foreigner had mentioned. The realization hit him so hard that he shuddered. The air rippled. Yuri felt the memory shift. The bright towers and stones split and faded, plunging into darkness, while the destroyed corridors gave way to an open field. Yuri blurted out in disbelief, asking if they were inside the ruins. The boy, now older, grabbed the master's cloak and screamed that he could not accept this. The master sharply knocked his hand away and ordered him to let go. The boy demanded to know how the master could stand against them alone, insisting that he would die. The master shouted back, asking if the boy had expected him to wait for reinforcements, and then declared that this was the end of Adalbane. Yuri watched this with bated breath, thinking it must have happened 10 years ago. The name Adalbane seemed familiar. A wave of orcs surged through the darkness in the distance. The trembling boy accused the master of using decoys, but the master sternly replied that there was no time to waste. He grabbed the boy by the shoulders and said that he had to survive and carry their wish forward, because that was the role of the next generation. The boy swallowed and replied that even if he ran alone, he wouldn't get far. He then insisted that he would rather leave the memories of the orc hunters here, within these ruins, and pass them on to their descendants. The master muttered that the boy was stubborn. Yuri's chest tightened as he realized that this was precisely why the memories were preserved here. The stone cracked with a powerful blow as the staff sank into the ground. The boy declared that they would leave these memories behind for future generations to see. Blue light poured through the darkness as he raised his glowing staff. He declared that what they were leaving behind was the secret of the orcs, as well as the techniques and experience of the most powerful orc hunter, and that even if they perished here, the next generation would fulfill their wish. The master looked broken and trapped. The boy struggled against the raging blue stream, his face filled with despair, and he prayed for it to work, begging that their deaths would not be in vain. Yuri watched, staring at the pedestal, bathed in blue light, and the limp body of the boy nearby. He wondered if the boy in the memory had been looking right at him. A faint, alarmed voice reached his ears and warned him to beware of the devil's tome. Yuri repeated these words in a shocked half voice, wondering what this devilish tome could be. The blue light shattered above the pedestal. The crystal cracked and exploded. The shards scattered into the darkness like falling glass. The faint voice faded, trying to reach him before fading away completely. Yuri's eyes snapped open beneath his helmet as he was thrown back into his own body. His breath caught in his throat. Lying amidst rubble and debris, he raised his head and asked where they were. One of the knights replied that they were still within the ruins. Another reported the disappearance of the skeleton that had exploded in light and the general relief at Yuri's rescue. He exhaled slowly and shared the joy at their safety. Yuri thought the hunter's memories didn't feel like an alien life. Instead, they felt like something buried deep within him, brought to the surface. He pointed to the entrance and asked if they were the ones who broke down the door. The knight laughed awkwardly and admitted that it had been difficult. Jard asked Yuri what he saw, and Yuri replied that it was something beyond normal vision. A deep tremor suddenly rolled through the stone beneath them. Someone shouted that it must be an earthquake, but Yuri immediately said no. His words were cut off by the sound of heavy, thundering footsteps. Yuri stated with confidence that the orcs had begun their attack. Jard panicked and asked if they had been discovered and if it was all a trap. Yuri sharply ordered him to shut up and looked around. He explained that these ruins were once the base of orc hunters, and that the orcs would naturally hasten to destroy the remains of the old enemy, which suddenly surfaced. Having assessed with his feelings, he determined the rhythm of vibrations and added that the attackers were riding Komodo dragons. After counting to himself, he finished coldly by declaring that there were 10 horsemen. Laurent urged them to retreat to the main forces. Yuri agreed that under normal circumstances, this would be the right decision, but then ordered everyone, including the Imperial Knights, to follow him. He confidently announced that they would prepare for battle. When Rodan asked if they had really decided not to retreat, Yuri replied that there was no need for that, and then he fell to the ground and examined the skeleton of the dead orc hunter. He took the weapon from his hands as if it had been carefully left for him, and he turned with a smile, adding that it was now clear how to fight these orcs. Outside, the plains burned beneath the setting sun. Komodo dragons thundered forward as a wave of orcs rolled across the land. One orc pointed his finger and roared just at that moment, when red flashes burst from the bushes, crashing into the horde. The orcs roared and rushed forward through the haze, but as they got closer, they had to slow down a little, because when the red light got stronger, a wave of indecision swept through them. Yuri soon appeared in everyone's sight and shouted loudly that the moment had come. At his signal, the knights, hidden in the thickets, rushed forward, although not everyone was very prepared for the sudden ambush. But they still ran forward to meet the orc army. Steel flashed as the first impact occurred. Jard sliced through the orc's torso and sealed the deal with a crushing blow. Laurent decapitated his opponent with one move, while Rodan got into his stance and plunged his blade into the orc's neck, causing the creature to howl as blood gushed down his throat. Yuri watched this and thought that everything was working. His hand tightened around the small red mark on his chest, and he found it incredible that the hunter's mark could change him so deeply. He realized he could read vibrations to count enemies and sense where to set traps, instincts he had never possessed before. He realized that this was precisely why the hunter had shown him those memories. A huge orc rushed at him with a roar. Yuri felt as if decades of experience were ingrained in his bones. He saw the perfect angle and the exact point to strike. He instantly rushed forward, and he thrust his sword forward, plunging it into the monster's left hand, which is why he immediately roared in pain and surprise. After which, the main character cut off the orc's hand with a swing, and then struck out, illuminated by a blue light, which ended the life of a creature without the need to cut the soul. The orc collapsed, blood spilling across the ground beneath the fading sunset. Standing over the body, Yuri said that he would continue the legacy left behind, addressing the fallen with respect as Adalbane's hunters. Night fell on the camp surrounding the ruins. Ragnar reported that, thanks to Yuri's actions, they had managed to secure the perimeter without losses. He told Yuri that he had done a great job, and Yuri replied that he was grateful to him. Ragnar asked if the ruins were a hunter's abode. Yuri replied that they contained traces of the hunter's last battle. Then he said that he wanted to ask Ragnar one more thing, and Ragnar stared expectantly. Then the protagonist asked if Ragnar knew anything about the Devil's Tome. Ragnar said he had never heard of him and asked if he was connected to the ruins. Yuri replied that he only knew about his connection with black magic. Ragnar said he would investigate and share everything he learned. Yuri bowed and thanked him. Later, Yuri walked between tents on a cold night. Some knight addressed him as the Prince of Briol. Yuri turned as a red-haired Imperial knight approached with a smile. Yuri asked if he was from the Empire. The man introduced himself as Rodan and said Yuri's performance in the fight had been impressive. Yuri replied that Rodan had fought impressively as well. Yuri asked if Rodan usually smiled, noting how constrained he had seemed earlier. Rodan replied that military discipline in the Empire was strict. He added that most people froze during their first battle, but Yuri fought like a seasoned veteran. Yuri's face tightened. Rodan jokes that Yuri must have left his lover at home. Yuri called Rodan by name and asked if His Highness Ragnar had ordered this conversation. Rodan tensed and began to deny it. Yuri bluntly assumed Rodan had come here to assess his romantic prospects. Rodan noticed that Yuri clearly did not welcome this attempt. Yuri said he really didn't want to be involved with the Imperial Princess. Rodan asked why, saying that everyone admired her and describing her as beautiful and kind. Yuri muttered her name, Katerina, and thought that with her kindness she made people feel special. Yuri abruptly dropped the subject and said he already had a girlfriend, which, frankly, was a lie. Rodan winced in surprise. Yuri forced himself to maintain his composure and said he was serious, adding that they cared deeply for each other, though his eyes darted away in confusion. In a low voice, he apologized to Sybil and repeated that he had a girlfriend, and said that was all Rodan needed to know. Rodan replied that he was glad to hear it, and shared his plans to propose to his beloved. Yuri snapped that such things shouldn't be said on the battlefield. He started to answer, but something heavy cut through the air with a sharp crack. When someone spoke words like that, something was bound to happen. Suddenly, a powerful explosion rumbled through the rear ranks. Fire shot up into the sky as Yuri and Rodin instinctively turned towards the explosion. Yuri barked that he had warned Rodin to be careful with his words, and noted that this was clearly an enemy attack. Flames engulfed the camp, tents collapsing in the flames. Soldiers retreated from the heat, while others shouted that the camp was on fire. Orders were shouted to protect the supplies, and figures darted through the flying embers, dragging boxes and barrels away from the growing inferno. Hernando stood facing the fire, his coat fluttering violently in the heat. For a moment, he entertained the idea of an underground assault, but he immediately threw it aside, realizing that hundreds of orcs had appeared right inside the camp. His face tightened as he realized that this was only part of the threat. He raised his hand and tested the air, his eyes narrowing. His dispel hadn't worked. This time, it wasn't a mistake. The resistance was deliberate. Yuri called out to him, asking if the spell dispel had broken. Hernando turned as Yuri rushed towards him through the smoke, reporting that the enemy sorcerers must have prepared in advance. Yuri replied with calm confidence that he would deal with them. He ordered Hernando to wait until the magic could be dispelled and immediately release his magic as soon as this window opens, adding that he was counting on it. Yuri then ran through the ashes while Hernando shouted after him, demanding to know how one could even identify a sorcerer. As he ran, Yuri mentally replied that it wasn't easy, but there was a way. Standing in front of the orcs emerging from the ground, a memory came to his mind about how the old master explained that orc sorcerers often lost their sight due to prolonged exposure to black magic, which left them with an unnatural, unsteady gait. Yuri knew that this method would only work if the memory was accurate. He came back to reality and began to scan the battlefield until his gaze fell on a lone figure moving awkwardly through the chaos. Yuri braced himself, identifying his target. With a sharp exhalation, Yuri drew his sword and threw it forward. The blade cut through the smoke. Like an enchanted dart, the orc instantly collapsed. Yuri jumped after him, clutching his throat, and with a cruel kick, he drove the sword deeper. Having completely finished off this huge monster, he stood firmly on his feet and announced that the sorcerer had been defeated. Then he noticed a shrinking ring of glowing red eyes surrounding him, and noticed that now he seemed to be in trouble. He realized that this was exactly what they had expected. As if on command, Hernando raised his hand and formed a spiraling mass of fire. Yuri shouted Hernando's name as the mage threw a fireball forward. The explosion rolled across the battlefield in a flaming wave. Yuri intercepted the spell in flight and redirected it at the surrounding enemies. The flames split as they recoil, pushed back as if by invisible walls. While the orcs writhed and burned, Yuri remained unmoved and asked if they still believed they had the advantage. Despite everything, they continued to advance, their numbers growing right in the smoke. Yuri clenched his jaw and muttered that he had brought this on himself, adding that they really seemed to have no end. He shouted at Hernando to shoot again. Hernando's body jerked in the air as if all the strength had been drained from him. He quickly apologized, explaining that there seemed to be more sorcerers present on the battlefield, suppressing his magic. Yuri cursed loudly, anger flashing across his face. He turned fully to face the horde, lowering his sword, and forced his voice to sound calm as he invited them to come closer, asking them to be more gentle. He admitted to himself that rushing alone into the very center just to eliminate the sorcerer was reckless. He realized he'd let himself get carried away. His grip tightened so tightly the skin cracked. He evened out his breathing and reminded himself that he died once before. Taking a low stance, Yuri gripped his sword as smoldering embers flew around him. He shouted out his name and firmly decided that even if he died here, it would not be a shame. Rising with a grim smile, he raised his blade and provoked the orcs to attack. A calm voice responded from the depths of chaos, expressing approval of his resolve. A heavy aura descended upon the battlefield, raising sparks and dirt into the air. A long-haired swordsman emerged through the smoke and flames, cutting through with a single, fluid strike. Yuri's eyes widened as he shouted that it was his master. Without turning around, the master told him to give it his all and leave the rest to fate. He explained that those who are willing to die are truly living, while those who cling to life are already dead. He added that only one who has achieved this state can be called his disciple. The master turned effortlessly and announced that he would demonstrate Jongsong's sword. Taking a deep breath, he unleashed the azure cloud and crimson glow sword art. Crescent Moon Impulse! A massive crimson arc of fire and steel swept across the battlefield, cutting a wide clearing as the night turned red. Yuri stared at it in awe, ash and sweat streaking his face. He realized that it was the same power he remembered, a power that rivaled the 10 strongest beings on the continent. The same crushing strength his father had once wielded. The master announced that he would take on half of the enemies and ordered Yuri to deal with the rest. Yuri responded sharply and rushed forward, his blade flashing as blue-edged energy erupted with each strike. While Yuri fought, the master watched him closely. He noted that Yuri's movements were rough and chaotic, but at the same time experienced and practical. While Yuri clashed with the huge orc and pushed him back, the master reflected on the fact that such talent never exists in isolation and inevitably attracts others to it. Looking around the battlefield, covered in smoke and ash, the master thought about the heavenly forces plunged into chaos and about the dark star spreading across the world. However, he also sensed a smaller star that was still shining. He wondered if this meeting itself was fate. A faint smile touched his lips as curiosity got the better of him. Yuri lunged forward again, slicing through flesh as blood sprayed across the scorched earth. Watching him, the master formulated one last thought, wondering if this child would one day be swallowed up by the world-threatening dark star, or rise to become the new star that will replace her. The next moment, the orc's blade cut through the chaos, and then another crushing blow fell, from which the earth shook, and dirt and sparks flew in all directions. An explosion thundered near the formation and enveloped the field in thick smoke. 2 red-eyed orcs burst out of the swirling dust, growling ferociously as they continued their onslaught. Prince Yuri turned towards the onslaught and called out to Jard and Laurent. Seeing their line begin to sag, he extended his hand forward and ordered them to stop the enemy. One knight rushed forward and blocked the heavy swing with a clang of steel, while another threw the orc back with a brutal counterblow. A cry of pain cut sharply through the clash of blades. Jard surveyed the battlefield and reported that there were too many underground tunnels, adding that they were losing ground too quickly. Yuri fell silent for a moment, listening to the tremors beneath his feet. Recognizing the truth of the warning, he added that the underground movement of such large forces clearly indicated trouble. Squinting, he peered deeper with his senses and realized that, besides the orc sorcerer, there was something else moving below. Jard called out to him again, but Yuri dropped lower and directed his perception into the vibrations beneath the battlefield. He asked himself where it was, and then demanded to know where they had dug the tunnel. Catching a faint, irregular rhythm through the soil, he suddenly focused on the source, which resembled something like a giant sandworm from legend. Yuri claimed to have found it. He rushed forward and gave a sharp signal for everyone to follow him. His men hurried after him. Jard doubted whether this was really the right direction, but Laurent immediately cut him off, saying that no one doubts Yuri's words, to which Jard reacted with visible concern. They stopped abruptly as the shaking intensified. Yuri said it was the central point, the place that vibrated non-stop. The air shook, and a hooded orc shaman came into view, baring his teeth and raising a crooked staff. The shaman began to chant a spell and pressed his palm hard to the ground. The earth groaned in response. Cracks quickly ran in all directions as the rocks heaved up, and something massive rushed upward with force. The surface cracked. Huge figures burst through the torn soil and leaped forward in a spray of debris as the earth crumbled behind them. Yuri watched this without flinching and muttered that everything was exactly as he expected. 3 orcvals advanced with raised weapons, their red eyes blazing and cruel grins spreading across their faces. Yuri noted that he had expected them to appear sooner or later. More orcs spread out behind them, forming a living wall that separated Yuri's group from the shaman. They began chanting again, shouting the words in unison as if casting a spell over the entire battlefield. Jard leaned over and said the enemy had deliberately targeted Yuri. Yuri calmly replied that he could see it himself. Yuri raised his sword and ordered each of them to take on one opponent and not lose. His knights responded immediately and dispersed. As Yuri stepped forward, his concentration sank back into the battlefield. He sensed that what was below wasn't an orc, and realized that ending this battle meant destroying this creature. He rushed towards the largest source of presence, the orcal, and swung his sword with all his might as the duel began. Orcval brought his curved blade down. Yuri met it head-on, steel screeching and sparks flying. The blow forced Yuri to move back, but he dodged and parried the attack, and pushed the weight of the blade aside. However, the orcval found a loophole, and delivered a quick blow through his defense. Blood spurted as the flesh tore. As the orc mocked him, Yuri thought it was annoying, and judged that the Orkval knew perfectly how to use the advantages of a curved blade. There were shouts behind him as the general battle continued. Yuri evened out his breathing and told himself that he needed to get this over with as soon as possible and return to his people. Orkval grinned, and Yuri rushed forward to finish him off. He struck, but the Orkval dodged, doing this with minimal effort, and blocked the attack at the last moment, turning every decisive attack into a shower of sparks. Yuri became increasingly irritated, thinking that the Orkval had read his movements and parried absolutely everything. He wondered if he was deliberately stalling while the battlefield crumbled around them. His concentration wavered for a moment, but quickly returned as the memory of his master's lesson surfaced. Bernard said that when the mind is distracted, the sword goes astray, and that no matter how urgent the situation, if the sword does not keep up, it will never catch the enemy. The younger Yuri demanded to know what he should do, and immediately a sword strike flew at him. In that memory, Yuri snapped that his master should have complained instead of waving his weapon, adding that he almost killed him. Bernard replied that Yuri had to choose, explaining that combat is fluid and full of paths beyond the obvious. He ordered Yuri to remember why he was fighting. Returning to the present, Yuri's face darkened and he said that it was quite in the spirit of his master, admitting that the grumbling had brought him back to normal. Tension coiled around his legs like a compressed spring. White energy enveloped his body as he soared into the air. In the distance, the shaman stood frozen, and Orkval's eyes flashed as he sensed a shift in Yuri's rhythm. Yuri leveled his sword and said that they were trying to provoke him. He jumped forward, stating that his original goal was to deal with whatever was underground. He brought his blade down with merciless determination. This blow tore apart the space beneath them and caused the massive underground creature to rush upward, letting out a sharp echoing cry, literally exploding from the impact. When the smoke cleared, Yuri was already moving again. He rushed forward through the white spiral of his own momentum. Looking straight ahead, he declared that breaking through like this was always the best way. The white force tore the ground beneath our feet and turned the soil into a crumbling crater, and the roar continued as debris and dust flew in all directions. Nearby, an orc brought his weapon down on Jard, and he screamed, calling upon his highness, barely holding back this blow. Among the settling debris, Prince Yuri staggered and thrust his sword into the ground to stay on his feet. He dropped to one knee, breathing heavily, and thought that he had used up all the mana in his body, including that stored in his core. Pain racked him, and he cursed that the blowback was worse than he thought. He forced himself to breathe, and thought that he needed some time to recover, adding that this would put an end to the underground tunnel. But he did not have time to finish this thought. The noise of battle erupted again, and another blow flashed past Laurent, causing his eyes to widen. The earth suddenly wrinkled and split. A multitude of gaping mouths erupted from the earth, like living pits. Laurent screamed desperately at Yuri to watch out, and he only gritted his teeth and cursed as the nearest mouth snapped right next to his face. Jard rushed forward and pulled Yuri away by force, and pulled him out of the bite zone, as the ground exploded behind them. He picked up Yuri and carried him running, whereupon Laurent rushed forward and cut the threat to pieces. They collapsed together on a safer patch of ground, still shaking from the impact. Yuri smiled tensely and thanked Jard. He replied tensely that next time Yuri had such plans, he should warn him in advance. Jard asked if Yuri was in any condition to fight. Yuri replied that he would be happy to, but his body was motionless. Jard muttered that it was a problem, which was answered by heavy footsteps. Huge bare feet landed nearby, and the ominous approach of a giant sandworm hung in the air. Jard asked if they thought they could return alive. Watching the shadows of his enemies, Laurent pompously called it an honor to die with Yuri, to which those around him merely rolled their eyes as usual. Yuri replied that this did not mean that they would surrender without a fight. He raised his sword despite the strain, and declared that they would take lives until their last breath. Yuri shouted for everyone to disperse. His men replied that they understood. Yuri then vowed to lead the way and charged forward, forcing his wounded body to move by sheer willpower. As he ran, a calm warning interrupted his impulse, telling him not to overexert himself. At the same time, a golden light rose up like a protective storm, and Yuri exclaimed in surprise, turning to Sir Graham. Sir Graham appeared in sight, enveloped in a glowing, swirling aura, and began to cut down their enemies. He said he had received orders from Prince Ragnar, and announced that from now on, they would help, bringing support to this battle as the pressure shifted away from Yuri. Later, the camp quieted down under a clearer sky. Someone asked if the enemy had escaped, And the answer came back that yes, they had. Inside the medical tent, Prince Ragnar listened to the report that by the time they arrived, Prince Yuri had already defeated the giant sandworm. The report noted that the enemy had surrendered after blocking the entrance. Prince Ragnar clicked his tongue in frustration, regretting the missed opportunity to interrogate the prisoners. Prince Ragnar looked at Sir Graham and said that he had done very well, adding that they would have lost a key member of the Allied forces if Graham had been even a little late. Sir Graham bowed his head and said he was grateful. Ragnar released him, telling him he could go. After that, Ragnar stood over Prince Yuri's bed and clicked his tongue. He said that Yuri was always making a fuss. Watching Yuri lie unconscious, Ragnar said it felt as if all the Allied forces existed solely to single out Yuri. Then he thought that this was to be expected, and concluded that this was exactly what Catherine's husband should be like. Yuri stirred and let out a strained groan. Later, Yuri sat up abruptly in bed, sighing sharply and covered in sweat. He cursed silently and wondered what this nightmare had been. Clutching his head, he thought it was like a prediction of a terrible future. A voice from the doorway asked if he was awake. Yuri turned and called Sybil by name as she walked inside. Sybil approached with a relieved look. Yuri asked what the situation was, demanding to know if everyone was safe. She told him to calm down and said the battle had ended safely. She explained that while Yuri was unconscious, the Allied forces advanced for 2 more days, adding that everyone had been understanding so that Yuri could fully focus on his recovery. She then asked how he was feeling and said that she calculated that his mana had been restored. When Yuri moved and checked his body, Sybil smugly said that he could thank her for it and boasted that he didn't receive holy healing from the princess of the Holy Kingdom every day. Yuri exhaled and said, okay, he was grateful, and then asked where they were at that moment. Sybil stood up from her chair and invited him to look outside, and holding out her hand, she said that she was sure he would be surprised. She led him outside, sunlight flooding the camp as they walked side by side. Yuri froze when the view opened up, starting to say that it was amazing, while Sybil watched his face and asked what he thought. She pointed to the distant walls and said that this was the final destination of the Allied forces, the fortress of Okua. Yuri said they had finally arrived. She replied that they had. Without looking away, Sybil grew serious and said that she should first thank Yuri. Yuri made a quiet, puzzled sound. Sybil said they wouldn't have made it this far without Yuri. She added that even if they had, the losses would have been far greater. She said she was very lucky to have Yuri by their side, and she thanked him again, squeezing his hand lightly with hers. Yuri swallowed, and then asked if, since she was so grateful, she could do him a favor. Sybil repeated the word in surprise, asking what service was being discussed. Yuri hesitated, and then cautiously said that if Sybil didn't mind, he wants something from her. For them to pretend to be dating. Sybil blinked and demanded to know what that was supposed to mean. Yuri scratched the back of his head tensely and said that he thought he might get a marriage proposal from Ragnar, and insisted that this was exactly what he absolutely wanted to avoid. He added that it would be good for Sibylla, too. Then he asked if her brother wouldn't try to marry her off as soon as she returned home. Sybil studied him for a moment, then relented and said okay. Yuri's eyes widened as he blurted out, "Did she really agree?" But then she raised her finger and said there was one catch. Sybil smiled sweetly and said there was one condition. She explained that since this business would be done under her name, she could not do it without some benefit to herself. With a bright smile, she suggested doing everything honestly and simply, using a wish token. Yuri froze and called the situation over the top. Sybil leaned forward and with a piercing gaze, asked if he was afraid of her strange requests. She shrugged with a sly grin and said that if he didn't like it, he could look for someone else. Yuri looked away, silently rubbing the back of his head. And then she asked, with whom is this marriage proposal planned, to avoid which he has to go to such lengths? Yuri answered directly that he was talking about the imperial crown princess. Sibylla cut him off in disbelief. She demanded to know why he wasn't grateful for such a chance, but Yuri insisted there was no reason for that, reminding her that he was, after all, a prince too. Yuri asked what she meant. Sibylla explained that the empire enjoyed greater state prestige than Brielle, and added that the princess was beautiful and had a wonderful character. She said that the princess had practically everything with her, hinting that he should be happy about it. Yuri crossed his arms over his chest, his face darkening, and he said he didn't want to get married. He said the princess's character was just a mask, and he insisted he saw it perfectly well. He turned away and said that, in any case, regarding the wish token she mentioned, he would put it aside and look for another way. Before he could leave, they were interrupted by a loud call, and Yuri flinched at the fact that he was being addressed. Prince Ragnar strode up, accompanied by his retinue, and said that he was just about to report back to his homeland about Yuri's amazing successes. He laughed and said he thought Yuri would sleep for at least 4 days, but he was already completely healed, calling him incredible. Yuri thanked him politely. Ragnar threw his arm over Yuri's shoulders and said okay, then added that his entourage seemed to have shown great interest in Yuri's news. Yuri's eyes widened as horror crossed his face, and Ragnar, glowing with enthusiasm, thought that this was a wonderful event and began to pat Yuri on the back. Covered in sweat, Yuri mentally agreed that a wish token or anything else would do just fine, and mentally prayed for help, and then called Sybil by name, as if crying out for salvation. Ragnar held the swaying Yuri, and Sibylla quickly told Ragnar that Prince Yuri had only recently woken up, asking him to show understanding so that Yuri could rest and come to his senses a little. She stepped forward gracefully. Ragnar asked her name, and she introduced herself as Saint Sybil, addressing His Highness politely. Ragnar noticed that she seemed to care a lot about Yuri, and asked if they were close. Sybil took Yuri by the arm and said that they were not just close, after which she announced that they were in a relationship. Ragnar stood frozen in shock as visual effects of love hearts literally exploded around the couple. He turned to Yuri with obvious disappointment, asking if it was true. Yuri forced a forced smile and confirmed that it was. Ragnar clicked his tongue in anger, and then awkwardly said that they looked great together, adding that they could talk about it in more detail later, since he was sure that they were both already fully awake. Having announced a close battle with Okua, he added that due to long marches and continuous battles, the troops would continue moving only after a short rest. At sunset, the silent camp listened to Ragnar, who called for full readiness before the long-awaited final battle. He added that on the other hand, the orcs will try to exploit their vulnerability in a new way. He changed his tone and said that nevertheless, they had the strongest fighters from all over the continent on their side, from the Empire, from the Briols, and from the Holy Kingdom, ending with the fact that now they simply could not lose to some orcs. Prince Ragnar stretched out his hand towards the Okua fortress under the scorching sun and said that from this moment on, they will begin to exterminate these filthy creatures of unknown origin. His fingers clenched into a fist, and he added that they would make the entire continent know their names. Watching the horizon, Yuri remembered how, with the firm goal of correcting past mistakes, he joined the Union and reached the very threshold of Okua without a single defeat. He thought that 5 years had already passed since he returned to the 13th year of his life. He thought that since then he had been training his body and technique, returning the legacy of his ancestors, and kept close to him those who would share his fate, bound by the bonds of fate. Following a plan that was clearly better than his previous life, while the sky was burning golden, Yuri thought that now that he had reached the level that allowed him to stand shoulder to shoulder with the strongest on the continent, only now did he come face to face with the very first culprit who had led to the fall of the Briols. In his mind, he declared that his only goal was to stop the fall of the Briols, and he vowed that this time he would definitely protect his people. The scene changed. Night fell on the imperial palace of the Gronsian Empire, and inside the wines were carried through the halls of the luxurious assembly, where aristocrats lazed and drank, and some people were already completely giving in to drunken lust. While the glasses were clinking, someone said that since the conversation had already started, they should mention the news about the Allied forces. The second one dismissed it as uninteresting and asked about the latest rumors. Someone's voice echoed that they would soon be facing a final battle. Someone gasped, and another added that, according to rumors, the Allied forces were invincible. Then someone else praised him, saying that this was to be expected from His Highness, calling it incredible. Lighting a cigarette, he noticed that His Majesty didn't even deign to glance at him. A man laughed and warned him that such things shouldn't be said in the palace. The woman raised her glass with a bored smile and said that it was time for them to change such a boring topic. She asked if everyone knew about the third Prince of Briol who had succeeded in the war. They answered in the affirmative. And she asked about the news, while someone was praising his appearance and a woman entered the room. She replied that from what she had heard, there was talk of his marriage proposal to the princess of the Holy Kingdom. Another responded with an enthusiastic exclamation. From across the room, a long-haired figure repeated Yuri Briol's name, as if confirming it for himself. Someone remarked enthusiastically that this must be love born on the battlefield, while another woman melted at the thought that it sounded very romantic. A calm voice cut through the chatter, noting that they seemed to be discussing a very interesting topic. Everyone in the room froze, Heads turned. People choked mid-sentence while taking a sip, stuttering and hastily rising from their seats. Those present quickly stood up and bowed, and said that it was a great honor for them to see Her Highness. The crown princess stepped forward, literally shining with an angelic light in this dark hall. Fanning herself, she said that she wanted to know more about the news she had just heard. She fixed her cold gaze on them and asked them to tell her everything in the smallest details. The scene gave way to a soldier's relaxation under a clear sky. One shared his plans to open a business at home after the war, while the other asked how he liked his food. Each said that when they returned home, they would finally pursue the dreams they had long put aside. Not far from them, Prin walked quietly through the camp, musing on how surprisingly well everyone had been getting along lately. He clearly remembered how on the first day they had barely exchanged a few words. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder like comrades. The conversation shifted, and he heard some of his subordinates mention that they had heard rumors that they had become quite popular throughout the empire. Another soldier replied that it wasn't they who had earned such glory, but rather Prince Ragnar or Prince Briol. He admitted that he deeply envied the prince's recognition. Prin looked up at the flag fluttering above them and found himself thinking of Prince Yuri Briol. From the very beginning, Yuri left a strong impression. There was always something wild about him. However, Prin couldn't deny that Yuri's achievements were astounding. It was Yuri who shaped the current spirit of unity. Yuri united them and made them fight as one. Realizing this, Prin realized that much of their current power came from him. One of the soldiers suddenly noticed Prin nearby and asked when he approached. Yuri was surprised that they had stopped sparring. Prince came closer and explained his visit as an interest in their training session. Yuri added with a smile that he seemed eager to join them himself. Yuri said that if he wanted to spar, he could tell his master, since he'd been bored lately. Prince quickly assured him he didn't need it. Instead, he suggested that Yuri visit Bruzin after the war. He added that he would be honored to show Yuri the Bruzin Sea. Yuri laughed and replied that he would remember this invitation. He suggested that after they defeated the orcs and the war was over, they would have a grand feast together. However, in the next scene, without warning, bells began to ring furiously throughout the camp. Under the bright sky, a dark and furious aura surged towards them. A desperate voice screamed that the enemy was attacking. The orcs were already on horseback at incredible speed. Ragnar's eyes immediately narrowed with tension as he turned his gaze towards the approaching threat in the form of an entire army of orcs. Yuri sighed quietly and noticed that there were so many advancing enemies that he couldn't even see the horizon. Prin commented that the situation on the opposite side was no different. Jard reported that the camp was completely surrounded by an orc army. Yuri asked if Jard was scared, noticing that he had become unusually silent. Jard snapped back that he wasn't afraid. Yuri laughed and noticed that Jard had changed. Explaining that in the past, he would have definitely complained about being dragged into such trouble, Jard demanded to know exactly what time period Yuri was referring to. Yuri calmly explained that he only meant that they had come a long way since then. He firmly stated that they would go even further because the journey was not over. A huge foot suddenly fell to the ground. The ground shook as a huge and ferocious orc stepped forward ominously. Jard reacted in shock, exclaiming at the overwhelming presence of the creature. Yuri squinted and came to the conclusion that it must be Okua, the orc king. The monstrous figure roared, and Yuri confirmed with certainty that it was indeed Okua. Immediately, the rest of the orcs took up the roar of their king, and their voices merged into a thunderous wave. The human soldiers refused to simply stand there. The blare of horns thundered in response, cutting through the chaos. Ragnar quickly lowered his sword and gave the order to attack. Okua's face was contorted with ferocity, his red eyes blazing like fire. Then both armies rushed forward, and the battle began in earnest. The human warriors urged their horses forward with fearless determination. Yuri raised his sword high and called out to Briol. Steel met flesh. The two forces clashed violently, and blood sprayed across the battlefield. The Okua army struck back with wild force, their attacks shaking the earth. The blade pierced the orc's neck, causing blood to gush out in a crimson stream. Those who witnessed this were momentarily frozen in shock. Yuri turned sharply and ordered everyone to maintain concentration. Suddenly, a heavy shadow passed over him. Someone looked up and wondered why the sky had suddenly darkened. A moment later, winged silhouettes appeared in the field of view, and a cry of horror echoed through the ranks that wyverns were descending. From the air, Okua's troops aimed their bows downwards. The arrows were drawn and released in a merciless volley. Instead of fear, a spark of excitement flashed across Yuri's face. He noticed that this was exactly the kind of fight the enemy had desired. He placed his hand on his sword and noted that such an attack from the sky would consume a colossal amount of mana. Despite this, he swung his blade. A stream of energy exploded outside, magic bursting into the air as if it would crush the very space around it. His face became stern as he continued to fight. With colossal force, he threw his sword forward, trying to crush the enemy's onslaught. The enemies above roared in shock at this sudden counterattack. Yuri calmly calculated that the height was sufficient. He took a low stance and jumped high into the sky. In a precise movement, he grabbed the reins of the steering wheel, which one of Akua's warriors was holding, and pulled it down, throwing him to the ground and seizing control of the air. He stated that if they believed they could attack safely from above, they were sorely mistaken. He swore that each of them would fall from the sky. His eyes darkened with killing intent as he raised his hand and made his firm statement. The scene changed. Armored soldiers clashed under the shadow of the palisade, blood splattering. Dark-winged wyverns swooped overhead, their riders screaming piercingly. On the ramparts, the knight reported to Prince Ragnar that the archers were standing ready. Ragnar didn't answer right away. He continued to stare at the sky, his gaze transfixed, as if he couldn't tear himself away from what was happening above. When the warrior called out to him again, Ragnar finally answered in a quiet, tired voice, admitting that he truly did not know anyone crazier than Yuri. High above the battlefield, Yuri clung to the back of a wyvern, weaving between the attacking enemies. The orc rider raised his bow, and Yuri immediately recognized the danger. A deadly shower of arrows cut through the open air as the riders came at him from all sides. He held his ground, his posture firm, his eyes narrowed as he read the wind, measured the distance, and anticipated each blow. He noticed the wyvern beneath him was impressive. Without slowing down, he spoke directly to the creature, noting that she should think with her own head and not throw her life away for the sake of the orcs. He pressed harder, arguing that even the slightest act of resistance could help save others of her species. The wyvern reacted with obvious irritation, snapping its jaws defiantly. Yuri laughed, taking this stubborn answer as proof that the creature understood him. He stated that if that was the case, then they should have given it their all. The wyvern swooped down, and Yuri decided to charge straight ahead. The wind tore at his cloak as he struck straight at the lance. His sword flashed once in a clean, decisive arc, and the enemy rider was instantly cut down. He took the brunt of the blow, but two more orc riders gave chase. In response, he twisted, doing a somersault in the air, and sharply began to decline. A smile appeared on his beaming face, and the white aura gathered on his blade, and with one cruel blow, he cut down both pursuers. He calmly stated that it was over with. Then he sank heavily back onto his wyvern. For a brief moment, it seemed like the sky belonged to them. Yuri mentally acknowledged that this exchange of blows had worked in their favor. However, his expression darkened as more wyverns approached them. He calculated that destroying them one by one would take too much time. Greenish-tinted energy swirled along his arm as he decided to change his approach and use his power differently. Below, the front lines began to buckle under the mounting pressure. A commanding voice shouted that they were obliged to hold the line. The response was heavy breathing and pained groans from the ranks, struggling to hold on. The knight cut down the advancing orc, but he staggered as new waves of enemies surged forward. He cursed that they seemed endless. Before he could regain his balance, he felt a shift in the air. He froze in confusion when the wind began to swirl violently, growing stronger with each passing second. He wondered why the wind was behaving so strangely. Faces turned to the sky. A green spiral swirled in the sky, and someone shouted Prince Yuri's name. The roar of battle faded beneath the oppressive weight of gathering mana. Yuri mentally described this technique as a force shaped by will, a slash that bisected the very soul. His gaze sharpened as the green stream wrapped tightly around him. He understood it as the rotational force of the wind-ringed sword and released it forward. Now he smiled, pleased with his abilities, and holding mana near him, compressed into a concentrated vortex. Yuri calmly confirmed to himself that the power was stable and thought about increasing its range. The whirlwind thickened, growing into a huge tornado that rushed downwards like a spear. It pierced the air and swept across the battlefield in a wide strip, scattering dust, weapons, and bodies. The warriors on the ground looked up in shock, One of them thought it must be the rumored third Prince of Briel. Another noted that the strength of one man rivaled that of an entire detachment. When Yuri came down, someone commented that his techniques were overly pretentious. Yuri muttered that they started grumbling at him the moment he landed. He casually stated that he would call it the spinning whirlwind sword, to which someone bluntly replied that the name was terrible. Yuri turned to Jard and asked about the most important thing: the state of the ground battle. Jard reported that thanks to Yuri, no damage was caused from the air, but that was the extent of the advantage. He warned of a fierce battle, where one side's weakness would destroy the entire formation. Yuri decided to maneuver across the battlefield and assist wherever possible. He turned his attention to another ally and asked who he was. The hooded man introduced himself as Gaunt Meriton, Baron of Faben and Knight of Joachim, and conveyed his greetings to the third Prince of Briel. Yuri greeted Joachim, calling him a powerful ally, and added that if Gaunt ever needed help, he should ask for it without hesitation. Gaunt slurred his gratitude, and Yuri immediately urged them to push the orcs back even further. Yuri checked on Jard again, asking if he was exhausted. Jard firmly replied that he was not. Yuri noted that every additional swing of their swords meant more lives saved. He ordered Jard to hold the front line. Jard agreed, and the battle continued with unabated force. Knights died in huge numbers. The orcs suffered no less heavy losses. The screams mingled with the furious clang of steel. The air thickened with the feeling that the war was nearing its end. As the silence, bought at the cost of countless lives, slowly descended, the sun rolled towards the horizon. Around that moment, something changed again, and the orc let out a furious howl. The soldiers instantly clutched their heads, screaming in agony as they staggered under the red-tinged sky. Yuri dropped to one knee, thrusting his sword into the ground for support. He stated that the one they had been waiting for so long was finally coming forward. He mentally noted that Okua had finally made his move. Yuri mused that if Okua did engage in battle, they still had Master Noyon's chain as a countermeasure. He noticed that both armies were locked in a brutal war of attrition, but despite this balance, something about the situation seemed wrong. A brutal roar echoed across the battlefield, primal and unnatural. Yuri's eyes immediately sharpened. He cursed that the orcs they had already killed were still getting up and moving. He shouted that Briel must prepare immediately, warning that the orcs were about to go into a berserker frenzy. The wave of berserkers crashed into the allied formation like a tidal wave. Yuri moved with controlled precision, striking and parrying as his weapons scraped against his armor in a storm of sparks. He ordered the soldiers not to retreat a single step, and told them to hold the line, no matter what. Nearby, a knight called urgently to the prince, telling him to look ahead. Through the crush of bodies and the flash of steel, someone noticed that Okua was retreating from the center of the fray, and exclaimed that he was trying to escape. Yuri's jaw clenched, and the next second he started chopping everything around again. He stated that under no circumstances could they allow Okua to escape, and he immediately ordered his troops to pursue him. The pursuit surged forward amid the chaos that reigned. Blades gleamed dully in the gathering gloom. Bodies stumbled and fell. The melee raged as Okua's retreat cut a winding path through the blood and rubble. Then night fell. Laurent rose among the exhausted soldiers, who proclaimed that victory was theirs. In the command tent, the commanders gathered around the map. One boasted that Okua's retreat meant a great victory for them, as the enemy had been completely routed. Another officer suggested that, since the enemy had retreated, they should take some time to rest. Someone else responded with warm approval. The second suggested focusing on recovery, since Okua was also wounded. The third agreed, noting that the long march had exhausted them and that rest would restore their fighting ability. Yuri abruptly cut short their optimism, declaring that they were talking nonsense. He asked if they had forgotten where they were and reminded them that they were deep in enemy territory. He warned that they had no idea what kind of plot Okua might have been up to. He was surprised by their carefree talk of rest in such conditions, and reminded them that it was Okua who had led the orcs, insisting on the threat hidden beneath the surface. Yuri said they must continue to apply pressure without delay. Then Ragnar spoke, explaining that during the battle he had sent mages to watch Okua's camp. He reported that those mages sensed an ominous aura rising from the depths of the enemy camp. Yuri concluded there was no justification for further delay. Ragnar gave the final order, announcing that they would set out at dawn, and ordering everyone to ensure that all preparations were impeccable. The assembled commanders unanimously responded that they understood. When the meeting broke up, Ragnar called out Yuri's name. Yuri approached the command table and asked if he had been summoned. The blonde commander stated that there was something he needed to discuss privately, and demanded that Yuri keep what he was about to say a strict secret. Yuri replied without hesitation that he could do so. Satisfied, the commander placed a blue, gem-like device on the table and activated it. The translucent barrier parted to the sides, closing the space around them. Yuri watched as the shimmering wall formed and realized that the commander was sealing the area with mana to block out sound. The commander hesitated, since Yuri was not connected to the Empire, but he was the only person present whom he sincerely trusted. He asked if Yuri remembered the destroyed letter. He answered affirmatively, recalling that it spoke of the Emperor's secret pact with Okua. Then the commander revealed that someone within the Empire was using black magic. Yuri fell into a deep silence after this announcement. The commander explains that the events of the day had demonstrated the capabilities of Okua's black magic, and suggested that he was capable of taking control of his enemies. He admitted that they still didn't know how far this influence extended. Yuri asked if he suspected a traitor within the Allied army. The commander replied that for now it remained only a suspicion, and that was why he called Yuri. This was not a matter he could entrust to an Imperial knight. Yuri promised to keep a close eye on everyone. The commander's stern expression gave way to a sly grin. He leaned closer to Yuri, as if sharing gossip, and asked if Yuri would like something. For example, meeting a Katerina when the war was over. Yuri replied dryly that he already had a girlfriend. The commander, in disbelief, launched into a tirade, protesting this statement. Visibly embarrassed, Yuri insisted he was telling the truth and urged them to believe him. Outside the tent, the air felt heavy. Ragnar explained to Yuri that relationships between men and women can crumble in an instant, and friendships often become distant over the years. The darkness slowly melted under the clear morning sky. The leaves swirled gently in the wind. The horse's eyes caught the sunlight as it stamped its hoof and rushed forward. The mounted knights lined up in battle formation. The warrior reported to the prince that all troops were ready, and the prince replied that he understood. Yuri asked what they intended to do with Master Moonchan. He was informed that the master remained inside the camp and stated that he was conducting the circulation of internal energy. Claiming that he would come forward when the time was right, Gigi chuckled. At the front, the prince surveyed the ranks and noticed too many empty spaces where their comrades had once stood. He reflected on how, after they had endured countless brushes with death and stepped over fallen allies, they had finally reached that decisive moment. Yuri cried out Briol's name, and the prince thought that no awkward words of comfort could ease the pain of lost lives. Yuri raised the banner of Briol high and declared that this would be the end. With a bright laugh, he noticed that he too had run out of words. The knights around him laughed in response. The soldiers shouted that they would meet again alive when it was all over, and Yuri swore that after that, he would pay for a huge round of drinks for everyone. The horn was raised and drained in one long gulp. The spears were thrust forward. Yuri ordered all forces to advance further, and the command to charge was given. The cavalry surged forward as one, hooves thundering on the ground, banners flapping in the wind, and the final assault began. Amidst the chaos of the battlefield against the Okua army, the soldier turned towards the thunderous noise, while the banners of Briol fluttered furiously in the wind. A jubilant voice announced that Briol had arrived and ordered the troops to clear the way to the fortress, shouting triumphantly while the soldiers advanced and surrounded the battlefield. Yuri urged his men to move faster and follow him, and his subordinates unanimously replied that they would do so, addressing him as Sir. He explained that the structure ahead was a siege tower, and said that it would serve as a springboard for them to make a direct assault on the fortress. His face remained tense with concentration as he prepared for the upcoming fight. At that moment, the orc rushed to attack, knocking down all the people in his path, and he rushed forward with a wild roar that shook the field. Yuri instantly drew his sword and declared that it was indeed that same bastard in front of him. He swung without hesitation and directed his blade forward. A pale streak of the spear's aura cut through the ground. The orc quickly raised his weapon to block, roaring even louder after he managed to deflect the spear. Both Yuri and the orc glared at each other with fierce determination, and then Yuri's blade began to shine with an ominous gleam, and in an instant he rushed forward, and with one blow he cut off the monster's head. As the orc's head rolled on the ground, he spurred his horse forward with unwavering determination, ran at full speed and stood on it, and then soared high into the air. When he landed, his expression was cold, and his eyes were icy as he noticed that it had taken quite a long time. He then turned to the soldiers and declared that this would be their final battle. From his elevated position, Yuri looked down with a frown and noticed the presence of black magic. He concluded that, as expected, a sorcerer was also involved. Jard reported that the preparations had been completed exactly as ordered. Yuri praised Jard for his work. and pointed out that the enemies before them were elite troops, strengthened by black magic, just like before. He said that Dispel would likely not work a second time, and noted that the stage was already set for them. He then asked if they should begin, and ordered Simon to raise the flag and signal their position to the commander. The soldiers replied that they understood. Yuri rushed forward first, calling for everyone to move. The moment the signal was noticed, Ragnar exclaimed that they had received it and that Briol had found Okua. He thought to himself that Yuri had handled this faster than expected, and secretly admired him for it. Ragnar immediately ordered the signal to be transmitted further and ordered the mobilization of elite troops. Prin burst out laughing and declared that they were finally entering a real fight, and then told Finnick that they were moving out. Sybil immediately replied that she understood. The tension was clearly written on the soldiers' faces. When the violent clash between both sides broke out in full force, the scene shifted. Advancing step by step, Yuri declared that everyone probably already knew the plan. He explained that the main forces would hold the line, while their role was much simpler, and even more dangerously, they had to kill Okua. The monster's roar echoed endlessly across the battlefield. Yuri stood in front of the soldiers like a true leader and pointed his sword forward, smiled with cold-blooded confidence, and ordered everyone not to die. Immediately, the steel of the swords began to tear the flesh of the monsters as he charged into battle against the towering enemy, striking swift, sharp, and relentless blows. The other knights fought almost at his level. The human army literally broke through to victory. Sybil refused to be left behind and concentrated with a fierce intensity. She suddenly jumped down from above and urged Finnick to move. He responded immediately, addressing her as Her Highness. As Finnick fought, he reflected on how people from different lands and different walks of life stood together, protecting each other in the same battle. He believed that there could be no more glorious battlefield for a knight than this. At the same time, Prin continued to gather forces before bringing down his sword with a mighty cry, fighting without stopping, while sparks flew from every furious clash of steel. A faint smile touched Yuri's lips as spiritual energy surged through him, and his gaze became sharper and more dangerous. A vortex of mana once again gathered around his sword. He then released a colossal wave of power that swept across the entire battlefield. After that, he suddenly stopped, just as another orc rushed at him. His keen eyes noticed the attack in time, and he barely managed to block the crushing blow. However, he realized that Okua had still not made his real move, and Master Mo had still not appeared, no matter how intense the battle had become. Although their side clearly held the advantage, an ominous sense of déjà vu haunted him, and he wondered if he had missed something critical. Then the orc suddenly collapsed to the ground, leaving Yuri frozen in shock. Right before his eyes, the creature's body began to writhe and mutate into something grotesque. Seized with horror, he thought that something like this should be impossible. His whole body began to tremble. Rage and panic simultaneously overwhelmed him, and he rushed forward and shouted Okua's name. And a second later, Okua stood before him in his most terrifying form. His eyes burned with wild madness. Okua raised his sword high and brought it down, causing an explosion that made the very earth tremble. In a voice as cold as ice, Okua asked if Yuri had only just begun to understand, and then laughed at him with frank cruelty. He ridiculed him as a fool, and baring his fangs, he mocked that it was already too late, delightedly declaring that Yuri would also soon become a living victim. In a matter of moments, the entire area was reduced to rubble and shrouded in thick black smoke that billowed endlessly into the sky. Inside that devastated wasteland, a wild laughter echoed again and again, harsh and eerie, echoing among the destruction. Yuri plunged into dark thoughts and finally understood why Master Mo had not appeared yet. This was because even he couldn't dispel the black magic. Yuri immediately concluded that before Master Mo arrived, he would have to at least destroy this spell himself. Filled with cruelty, Okua swung his huge hand, delivering a vicious blow. Yuri coolly dodged, although a painful groan escaped his lips when this one blow split the earth into uneven layers. Gripping the sword tightly in his hand, he thrust it deep into the ground. His body shook as he mentally acknowledged that he couldn't continue like this for much longer, and had no idea how much longer he could hold out against a monster of that level. However, once he realized what had to be done, he was determined that he could not retreat simply for his own sake. Straightening up with stubborn pride, he declared that it would be all or nothing. Okua noticed that the strange sword cut through their very essence. Yuri immediately replied that it was true, and then warned that it would be wise to fear him, because he had no intention of dying without a fight. Then he noticed something. he realized that the substance pouring out of the orcs was being drawn to Okua's back. Crimson streams of energy continued to flow endlessly into the monster's spine. All around him, desperate voices were crying out for help, begging to be put out of their agony, and lamenting that the suffering was so unbearable that they would rather die. Yuri said gloomily that this was the worst possible outcome. At that moment, he realized the truth, and his teeth clenched in rage. The source of black magic was the souls of those who were consumed alive, souls that were exploited even after death. He firmly decided that he had to end everything here and now. Okua noticed how recklessly he attacked straight from the front. Okua bared his razor-sharp teeth and rushed forward, mockingly calling him a stupid man. Yuri's face darkened and he rushed forward like a storm, unwavering. But the first encounter turned out to be a failure for him. His helmet was knocked off, and his eyes widened as he saw the horrific scene before him, with countless red streams rising from the ground and converging into one in an instant. The next moment, everything seemed to shatter into pieces amidst shattered shards and cries of despair. A couple of seconds later, Yuri fell to his knees, blood streaming down his face. Black cords bound his hands tightly. Okua's contemptuous voice came back and declared that all his efforts were pointless, saying that this was the limit of his struggle. Then the sword in Yuri's hand suddenly began to glow with furious anger. He ordered the voice to shut up, and declared that he had carried too many burdens in this life to fall in such a place. Driven by rage, he swung his blade and easily cut through the black bonds. In a flash of light, he rushed forward like lightning and unleashed a relentless barrage of attacks on his enemy. Grotesque, ghostly faces rose up in the midst of chaos. As a blinding light poured across the battlefield, Okua admitted it was better than expected. Fatigue instantly washed over Yuri, and he realized that he could no longer see souls. Just when he began to think he had succeeded, a huge hand suddenly appeared nearby. Without hesitation, he went into a defensive stance, but the blow still fell with such force that split the earth and sent him on a long flight. He collapsed into thick smoke and screamed in pain. Gritting his teeth, he realized that he had reacted too late and that his left arm and ribs were almost shattered. Laurent rushed towards him in alarm and called out to him, addressing him as Your Highness. But the danger was not over. Okua was already walking towards them and spoke fiercely, noticing that a knight capable of cutting through black magic really did exist. With blood on his face, Yuri noticed that Okua was speaking a continental language. It's natural for a sorcerer, but Yuri didn't understand why even Okua used it. Step by step, Okua got closer and declared that as a reward for the pleasure he had given, he would personally grant Yuri death. Then the monster's fist rushed forward with crushing force as he commanded him to die. Both Yuri and Laurent were instantly overcome with horror, and Yuri instantly realized that he would not be able to block this blow. Then, from afar, a persistent cry was heard. A figure appeared in the distance, desperately trying to intercept Okua's fatal blow. The moment Yuri saw the newcomer, a faint smile touched his lips, and he noticed that he was late. A calm and confident figure apologized for the delay and ordered them to retreat. Master Muyan then said dispassionately that he would deal with this monster himself. Okua roared furiously and ordered him not to interfere, and then he strengthened his aura 100-fold, trying to fill the entire battlefield with it. Immediately, a powerful heat burst out from the master's body, and a stream of flame instantly rushed forward. The battle, fiercer than ever, was on the verge of a new explosion. When the two forces collided, everything was engulfed in a sea of fire. Laurent asked anxiously if His Highness was all right, and Yuri gently replied that he was still alive. He couldn't help but exclaim in amazement that their opponent was incredible, while Laurent agreed and noted that it was a battle between monsters. Master Muyan kept his cold, piercing gaze fixed on the monster in front of him. Compared to Okua's huge body, he looked almost insignificant, and yet he had just landed a heavy blow that had damaged Okua's arm. In response, the creature bared its razor-sharp teeth in a barely noticeable, chilling smile. Okua regenerated his damaged arm almost instantly, and noticed that Master Muyan's attack was quite a trick. Although his tone held an ominous warning, Master Muyan was momentarily taken aback when he realized the wound was already healing. Okua's ferocity increased as he declared that they were nothing more than pathetic creatures and that he would show them the true difference in strength. Master Muyan looked at him with a grim concentration, muttering that this creature was indeed a monster, and gripped the hilt of his sword tighter. A blazing red aura soon enveloped Master Muyan's entire body. At that moment, one of Okua's followers suddenly appeared and informed his master that he felt great power from Master Muyan, offering to help in the fight. Okua paused for a brief moment, considering these words. Then he slowly licked his lips and said that no help was needed. Grabbing the subordinate by the head, he lifted him into the air and sucked in all his spirit. Master Muyan gritted his teeth in disbelief and shouted that Okua had stolen power even from his own kind, accusing him of devouring his own people. Okua asked, puzzled, what Master Muyan meant by subordinates. He explained that humans and orcs were different, just as he himself was different from these creatures. With these words, he crushed the head of his subordinate and mockingly asked if Master Muyan really considered the worms crawling on the ground to be his subordinates. Filled with anger, Master Muyan rushed forward and struck furiously, cursing Okua as a bastard. Okua only frowned and dismissed him as a lesser being. Then, clenching his fist, he struck straight into the oncoming blade. The collision caused a violent explosion. Master Muyan stared forward in shock as he realized that Okua had stopped the sword with just his bare hand. A dark aura erupted from Okua and wrapped around Master Muyan's body. Okua brought his fist down with crushing force, splitting the ground below. Then he raised his hand again for a powerful swing and began to beat the ground over and over again, turning everything beneath it into solid rubble. While this barrage of blows continued, Okua stated that it is natural for the weak to be eaten by the strong, and said that Master Muyan could never hope to defeat him, pressing his foot hard into the ground. Okua used this power to fly high into the air. Getting ready to end it, he grinned evilly and declared that Master Muyan must die and become his food. Master Muyan's smiling face appeared through the thick smoke. He sarcastically remarked that Okua was chattering too much and sounded like a child just learning to speak. Then he recalled Okua's statement that the weak are always devoured by the strong and asked if he had ever seen a sunset to the very end. Okua froze at this question as the wave of light engulfed him. Immediately, a shining sphere appeared in front of him. Master Muyan raised his sword and slowly closed his eyes. Calling upon the Azure Cloud Sword and Crimson Sunset techniques, Okua walked towards him angrily and called him an insolent man and declared that he would swallow it whole. Master Muyan opened his eyes again, his blade now enveloped in crimson energy, and also a new core appeared in his aura, filled with bright and pure energy, and the master released the technique known as Empty Mountain under the bright moon. Driven by a new surge of energy, he slashed furiously at Okua. Okua spat out furious curses, but Master Muyan continued to press him, attacking with crushing blows one after another. Finally, Okua spat out blood and agony, after which he lost consciousness and collapsed to the ground. Master Muyan breathed heavily and thought that everything happened as expected. This technique put too much strain on the body. Bending over and resting both hands on his knees, he thought about that despite this, the corrupted creature that had ravaged the western lands had finally been defeated. Looking around, Master Muyan thought about continuing the fight. He decided that his student and the others would deal with the remaining enemies, and now he himself must completely destroy this abomination. Cursing through his teeth, he reflected that although he had expected something terrible, but I had never imagined anything so horrific, and I wondered how many people had been sacrificed to create it. Then Okua suddenly appeared behind him and said that what Master Muyan had seen so far was not the whole truth, and that beyond his imagination, the darkness was far deeper and far more terrifying. Master Muyan shuddered and retreated in confusion, horrified that the monster was still alive, even after its head was pierced. Okua's body began to regenerate again, the wound slowly healing as he explained that the nightmare Master Muyan had witnessed had been building up over a very long period of time. Master Muyan dealt him another powerful chop, but this time it had no effect. Okua slowly advanced and said that when the creatures were hungry, they devoured each other like worms, reminding Master Muyan that he had already explained this. To him, Master Muyan and everyone else were no different from insects. Then he raised his enormous hand over Master Muyan. Hearing the noise, Yuri turned his head towards the scene. His face immediately tightened, and he muttered in disbelief that this simply couldn't be happening. Then he saw that Master Muyan had already fallen completely under Okua's control, and he screamed in panic to his master. Master Mo was under the control of a huge hand made of corpses, and gritted his teeth as the creature continued to grow beneath him. He rushed forward with a flaming, slashing sword, and with one blow, he cut through the writhing body and landed heavily, breathing deeply. With disgust in his eyes, he turned to the monster, and he said that it wasn't enough for this bastard to turn the dead into materials for black magic. He also merged with them. At that very moment, a red-black force burst out, causing the armored knights and soldiers to recoil in shock. One of them cried out in disbelief, and the other began to define what they saw before the furious aura plunged the battlefield into complete chaos. Yuri stared at the monstrous figure swelling before him and said that this was madness. The knights gathered around the master and the monster of corpses that had formed before him. As the enormous form took shape within the seething black magic, Yuri realized that this would not end until they cut down this disgusting creature. He immediately realized the danger and thought that the black magic he had cut through earlier was far from complete. He came to the conclusion that if they couldn't stop Okua in this state, the Union army will be completely destroyed, and Briol's death will not be prevented. Laurent hurried to his side and told the prince that he must retreat and return to Briol. He stood in front of him and said that from that moment on, the battle was becoming too chaotic. Jard also intervened and said that the rest should be left to them, adding that the prince had already done more than enough. Yuri paused for a moment, then, deep down, rejected the idea. He thought that the concept of enough had never existed, that Dune did not wait for men to prepare for it, and that even if he retreated now to make plans for the future, there was no guarantee that a better chance than this would ever present itself. He forced himself to move again with a hard slap, turned to them and asked what exactly he had to retreat from. He asked if they truly believed they could fight properly without him. He mentally confirmed that once they'd come this far, there was no turning back. He called Jard and Laurent by name and said he was giving his next order. He declared that they would defeat Okua and carve out a secure future. He ordered them to send a messenger and signal Hernando to remain ready, and then disperse and eliminate every black mage hiding in the camp. When both men simultaneously responded in agreement, Yuri studied the towering monster and concluded that, now that Okua had grown to such a size, physical attacks alone had clear limits. While Master Mo was fighting the abomination face-to-face, Yuri realized their mission. He decided they needed to create a breach in the dispersion and unleash magic there. Before them, Okua roared under the red-black stream, while Master Mo continued to meet him with flaming sword blows, directing flame and steel against the bloated body. Despite this, the monster's black magic continued to spread and regenerate around him. Then Prin entered the fray, enveloped in blue power. He rushed forward and shouted that he would join the fight, after which he plunged his blade into Okua with a flash of power. The giant recoiled, but his stone flesh and dark aura surged forth again. With murderous contempt, the monster declared that they were nothing but pathetic insects, and then brought his power down with such force that people were scattered and blood splashed across the ground. Master Mo rushed forward again without hesitation. He shouted that he was Okua's opponent, roared, and rushed into another exchange of blows. Fire blazed around him as he slashed through the giant's body again and again, each blow exploding with heat and debris. Okua responded with crushing force, but Master Mo refused to give in and simply avoided, and continued to attract the monster's attention to himself, while every blow was reflected by an explosion of flame on the battlefield. Watching this collision, Yuri simply stood in shock, gritting his teeth tightly because he couldn't help the master yet. And then he quietly exhaled and admitted that there was not enough time to find and eliminate all the hidden shamans. Despite this, he didn't back down from his conclusion. He adjusted his grip on the sword and assessed the battlefield, and thought that if they could reduce the number of shamans even a little, they would be able to break through and split the black magic surrounding Okua. With this firm resolve in his mind, he waited for the soldiers to move out to carry out his orders, while Master Mo and the others continued to hold the monster in place. Yuri held the sword vertically and thought that if he could split the black magic and to break the spell around Okua at least once, this one blow will already be enough. Okua immediately sensed it and growled that an annoying insect was crawling up. He ordered the surrounding orcs to tear off Yuri's limbs and lay them in front of him. The orcs immediately rushed forward, but Sybil and her knight cut off their path and rushed to intercept them. She shouted that Yuri was up to something and said that she would cover for him. Phoenix shouted to Yuri that they would hold off the enemy, so he had to hurry. In the midst of this fight, Yuri evened out his breathing and felt the streams of black magic himself. He realized that she was swelling, absorbing death. He thought that his mana had already reached its limit. There was nothing left, and his body could barely stand on its feet. Despite this, a memory came to his mind, telling him never to fear the enemy and do what he believed in. Yuri resigned himself to the fact that until the very end, he would simply fulfill Briel's duty. He thought about the weight that Briel's name carried, about the mission that this name imposes on him, and firmly decided that he would simply do it. He fulfills the calling given to him by the name of the guardian, Briel. The scene changed. Hernando watched the soldiers fighting amid the chaos and said that His Highness was right. Since the orcs could no longer fight properly alone, he concluded that Okua was draining their lives with black magic, and if this continues, the allied army will be destroyed. The elderly mage approached and noticed that Hernando was staring intently at the battlefield. Hernando replied that the prince had told him to be ready when a breach appeared, and immediately use his magic. The elderly magician showed understanding and said that while Prince Briel was exceptional, this situation was on a whole other level. When asked why, he explained that Okua had become one with the black magic. He said that even if someone completely stopped the life force flowing into Okua, no one should have enough strength left to immediately return to battle, and that even if the prince did create a breach, only a handful of mages in the allied forces, or even on the entire continent, would be able to cast a spell powerful enough to deal critical damage to Okua. Hernando calmly replied that there was no need to worry about that part, and then his eyes widened, and he looked at the battlefield again. At that moment, a blinding pillar of light rose up. The elderly mage stared forward in shock, along with his young colleague, and when he saw the battlefield again, Hernando shouted that the black magic had disappeared. Speechless for a brief moment, he called Hernando's name again, but he didn't answer. Hernando told him to back off, and with a weak smile, said that since their precious prince had asked for it, then he will send him a particularly large spell. A huge magic circle opened. The elderly mage gasped in disbelief as the spell was cast, and a giant fireball began to gather in the sky. Now they stood and looked at the new sun that Hernando had created. Below, the shamans looked up in alarm. Okua also looked at the sky with interest, and said that the density of mana was incredible, refusing to believe what he saw. Yuri saw the flaming mass descending and shouted for all troops to prepare for the attack. The soldiers prepared to take the blow. Master Mo also adjusted his grip on the sword, and altogether, they decided to meet the approaching explosion without retreating. Then the spell came down. Okua roared that he would not be defeated and put his hand out against the falling fire, but the blow engulfed the battlefield in a colossal explosion. While inside the barrier, Yuri and the nearby soldiers withstood the shockwave. But the main orc had a hard time. All the shamans and orcs were consumed by hellfire, screaming as the fire rolled over them again and again. As the blazing devastation spread, Yuri noticed that the power was beyond his imagination. Then came another thought. That, fortunately, for the moment this had bought enough time, and through the raging fire, Hernando cast a spell on the monster and declared that Okua must burn to ashes. Sybil let out a tired sigh and told Yuri that if he ever did anything like that again, he should warn her in advance. Yuri replied that it was not a clear plan, but just improvisation. Looking over the scorched battlefield, she said the result was remarkable, as Okua and his orcs were now reduced to ashes. Yuri stared at the ruins and wondered if it was finally all over, but his gaze suddenly became sharp. A blackened mass rose from the charred debris. Okua, barely holding back the disintegration of his body, said that it was not over yet, and that insects like them would never be able to overcome him. Yuri stepped forward and said that Okua had already lost. There was now nothing left to keep him alive, and he had to accept his defeat. Okua glared at him and called him the Emperor's dog, blamed him for everything, and said that he would drag Yuri away with him. Even in this broken state, he rushed forward in a final attack. Before he could reach Yuri, a blue strike fell, and a beam of pure energy literally pierced the monster's chest. Hernando intervened with cold composure and said that it was the end. Looking down at Okua, Yuri asked if this pathetic struggle was all he had left before he died. Okua, continuing to disintegrate, said that it was not over. Black magic is darker and deeper than Yuri could ever imagine. One day, it will consume him, and he will wait for that day to come. Then, his body crumbled to dust. The soldier stared at the place and said that the monster was dead. At that very moment, the battlefield erupted in jubilation. The soldiers shouted that they had won, survived, and really done it. Joy, relief, and all other emotions burst out at once. Nearby, Master Mo groaned softly under the noise, hugging himself as the cheers continued to thunder. Yuri exhaled, laughed weakly, and said that now it finally seemed real, confirming that they had succeeded. Then the soldiers noticed him and rushed towards him at once. They called for their prince and rushed at him in excitement. Yuri stepped back in confusion, but still fell. When they grabbed him, they shouted that they had broken through, and the protagonist thanked them for believing in him. However, another surprise awaited him in celebrating this victory. New soldiers came running in a crowd, shouting that they also wanted to participate and hug him. Yuri immediately realized the danger, cursed through his teeth, and shouted for everyone to stop and stay back. No one listened to him. The soldiers piled on top of him, calling his name over and over again. Buried beneath armor and limbs, Yuri weakly pleaded with them to be gentle with him. Someone shouted that he was about to lose consciousness. Another yelled for everyone to leave, while someone else demanded to know who said it. And while the celebration consumed the battlefield, something dark again quietly stirred within the remains of Okua. Dawn broke over the battlefield. The survivors proclaimed that they had won the war. The priests said it was a hard-won victory, achieved through months of traversing a long, divine, and abandoned battlefield. Before anyone started celebrating, he said they should first honor the memory of those who sacrificed their lives for this victory. Standing before the rows of covered bodies, he declared that God's gaze does not divide people into high and low, and that the devotion and courage of the fallen were attested by the Lord. He said their great sacrifices would form the foundation of the continent's future, and those sacrifices should never be forgotten. Yuri turned to the sunrise and said, "May the Lord guide their souls to heaven." Soon, by order of the priest, the scroll was taken, and then the holy purifying flame is called upon to give their bodies over to the holy fire, so that the fire would consume their souls. Yuri quietly repeated the word, paradise, and then thought bitterly that paradise was meant for those who kept the faith, while hell was for liars. He silently remembered Stefan, Payne, Altos, Gate, Aymar, Goosendy, James, and Dyke. He thought that he was still standing there and not in hell, and came to the conclusion that all that the living could do now is to pray for heaven for the dead and to continue moving forward, carrying their will within oneself. As the list of fallen brothers drew to a close, Yuri silently gripped his sword and said it had been an honor to fight by their side. Then Yuri looked up when he heard his name being called. He called Jard and Laurent by name and told them that there would be many more scenes like this to come, or even far more terrible ones. He asked if they were still with him after all this horror. Laurent replied that he was ready and placed his hand on his heart. And Jard added that he had no choice and he would not abandon them. Yuri accepted this answer and said that he understood everything and told them to follow him right in front of a beautiful sunset. A few days later, in Bolshada, Yuri entered a bright hall filled with music, alcohol, and loud laughter. He walked in with Laurent and Master Mo as the barrels were being opened and the winners were celebrating. Yuri looked around and noticed that it was very noisy. Laurent said everyone seemed completely relaxed. Master Mo said that they had won and told Yuri not to judge too harshly. Laurent complained that only 3 days had passed and they had buried their comrades only a few days ago. Yuri explained that this is precisely why people needed to immediately switch their attention to something. He said that if they didn't do this, their thoughts would remain filled with their fallen comrades. Laurent was immediately moved and loudly declared that he now understood Yuri's wisdom. While Yuri was mentally thinking that Laurent was only getting worse, all three approached the royal table. Yuri expressed his gratitude to His Highness for the invitation, and he noticed them. Ragnar greeted him warmly and told Yuri to sit down, and also invited Sir Laurent and the head of Mo to take their places. After they had settled in, Ragnar raised his glass and said that everyone had probably guessed why they had been gathered here again. He explained that they were actually there to celebrate, but also for the sake of an important announcement. He said that in recognition of everyone's service in this war, they wanted to invite all the leaders of the Allied forces to an imperial festival. He added that the emperor himself was overseeing this festival and ordered them to take whoever they wanted with them. One of the Allied leaders cautiously inquired whether this festival was what he thought it was. Ragnar smiled and said that was indeed the case. He then revealed that the event would be a fencing tournament. At another table, Sir Gaunt repeated the phrase fencing tournament with a worried expression on his face. Yuri noticed this and asked him what happened. What was wrong with this tournament? Gaunt awkwardly said that Joachim was not renowned for his swordsmanship, and that participating in such a tournament would only disgrace them. Yuri listened to this and thought about it. He remembered that Joachim was a mountainous region dividing the Aloysius Range from the Empire. Because of this terrain, its inhabitants have always specialized in ambushes and guerrilla warfare. All sorts of tricks, bows, long-range combat, that was their forte. At the same time, he learned from Gaunt that the newly expanded troops still lacked proper discipline and were too easily relaxed. Realizing that this situation could be useful, Yuri looked up and said he had an idea. He suggested to Joachim that he send a group of knights to Briol and said that Briol would take care of their training. Gaunt stood up in surprise and asked Yuri if he was serious. Yuri calmly confirmed it, explaining that it would strengthen relations and help the two countries' soldiers grow. Deep down, Yuri remembered that when the Empire's serpentine forces had swept across the continent in his past life, Joachim had been their first target. He recalled that all those who were strongest in land battles always had difficulties in the mountains, and came to the conclusion that Joachim could become a powerful ally, capable of helping to contain the Empire. So he ordered Gaunt to send one group first, adding that Briol would prepare a course for Joachim. Touched, Gaunt called the idea brilliant. Nearby, the red-haired Duchess noticed Yuri, but did not wait for a greeting. Irritated, she complained that he hadn't even seriously intended to say hello to her. Before this annoyance could get any worse, someone suddenly appeared in front of her. It was an excited young knight with a large bouquet. He said he brought it for her and begged her to accept his sincere heart. After a short moment, she looked stunned. But then her expression hardened. In a rage, she ordered him to take those flowers to his damned prince instead of her. The young knight cried out in disbelief as her anger exploded, and later, alone in her room, she sat and combed her hair in front of the mirror and muttered that all this was terribly irritating. Suddenly, someone entered her chambers. Without even turning her head at first, she coldly reminded him that she had already told no one to enter her room without permission. When she realized it was Hernando, she called him by name and asked what was wrong with him. Hernando calmly said that there were too many prying eyes outside and asked her to be understanding. As he spoke, golden light spread throughout the space, and interception magic sealed the room. The Duchess recognized the spell and instantly became more alert. She said she was waiting for someone else, and then asked what he was doing there in the middle of the night. Hernando told her to see for herself. He picked up the scroll, shrouded in an ominous red power, and said that he found it on Okua's corpse. The Duchess stared at him and asked what it was. Hernando told her to cast a mind shield first, and then come closer and examine him. She narrowed her eyes and asked what could possibly have made him so worried. Even as she approached, she warned that if there was nothing serious there, she would throw him out. The moment she touched the scroll, the thing exploded with power. Scarlet letters burst out and wrapped around her like living chains. She recoiled in shock as the room filled with unrecognizable symbols and malevolent force. Energy wrapped around her neck, shoulders, chest, and limbs. She said she couldn't move her body. Then the curse pulled her mind into a vision. She saw a crimson world inside the Black Tower, and now she stood motionless and watched it all. The sight alone made her panic. Above it all, a monstrous eye hovered, staring at her from the red darkness. She thought she should have understood everything the moment she saw how worried Hernando was. She began to feel sick, and she admitted that she couldn't look deeper inside it because if she did, the creature would consume her. Even in the midst of this horror, she bitterly complained that she had just taken a bath. Then, irritated by everything that was happening, she raised her hand and created an aegis. A blaze of blue power split the room and cut through the surging curse, giving her enough time to cough and come to her senses. After this collision, Hernando noticed that the object was sealed with multiple layers of mana wall, and yet the energy inside was still trying to escape. The Duchess stared at the sealed red mass on the table, still confused by the curse that had just entangled her body, and demanded to know what it was and why Okua's corpse was carrying such a thing. Hernando, standing next to her with ragged breathing, admitted that he didn't know for sure yet. He explained that he had examined Okua because the dark spell he had used was strange, and while searching the corpse, he had discovered this energy-pulsating thing among the other bodies. He then revealed how he had obtained it. He said he had suppressed the power of the energy and had to make a deep thrust to pierce the corpse. The Duchess was shocked and exclaimed that he had used this power without lifting the restriction. Hernando replied that he had done so with the help of the Empire's mages and said it hadn't even been difficult. He quickly added that he wanted her to decipher it using her higher deciphering skill. The Duchess crossed her arms over her chest and thought about it. After a pause, she said she could try, but there was no guarantee of success. She explained that she had never seen these symbols before, and the object itself was too dangerous. As her fingers hovered over the glowing shell, she said that she assumed it was a fragment of some kind of dark spell book. She remembered that Okua knew how to use it, and her expression changed. She called the thing's appearance too convenient, and Hernando immediately asked what she meant. The Duchess said that dark magic grows stronger through sacrifice, that this item somehow ended up in the hands of the Orc King by a ridiculous coincidence, and that allied troops were also gathered there at that very time. She said it almost looked as if everyone was being used as bait. She added that the battle was won only thanks to Prince Briol, who cut through the dark magic, and asked what would have happened without him, and whether Hernando had no idea who gave the thing to Okua. She said the mere thought of it made her feel sick, because everything had worked out perfectly, as if according to a written plan. Hernando tensed up and told her to stop there. He said she was crossing a line and warned her not to dig any deeper. At that moment, a voice came from the door asking why they had to stop. Yuri stepped over the threshold of the room, and his sudden appearance made both of them turn around. He said he was curious about the Duchess's opinion and asked if she had hinted that there might be a puppet master behind the war. Hernando immediately warned him that such speculation could lead down dangerous paths. But Yuri ignored this and told the Duchess that he knew her suspicions were based on more than just the timing of the event. He asked if she had any other reasons for thinking that way. For a moment, she just glared at him. Then, instead of answering, she demanded to know why he'd entered the lady's room without permission. Yuri was immediately caught off guard. Returning to the topic, she noted the Empire's strange behavior. Rumors circulated that the Emperor had gone mad and sent the prince to war to get rid of him. An irritated Hernando called out to Mary Rose, and the atmosphere became tense. He said there was insufficient evidence to support such a conclusion, but Yuri supported her conclusion. After thinking it over, he admitted that it did indeed make sense. Gigi said that he and another person were also suspicious of this war. He then turned to the red sphere on the table, placed his palm on it, and said that this dark magic had also been detected. The moment his fingers touched the seal, the barrier reacted violently. A beam of light flashed, and Hernando and the Duchess cried out in alarm that the seal was dangerous. The red shell split open, the page sealed inside flew up, and red-black energy flooded the room. Yuri looked at it without panic, while the cursed force lashed out around him. Everyone shouted to His Highness, but Yuri continued to look up, as if he recognized something. Then the monstrous crimson eye appeared again, hanging over the darkness, as a sign of someone's invisible will. Yuri didn't flinch. The girl and the magician continued to watch with bated breath what would happen next, and after a short silence, the main character said that he understood everything. He recalled the memory of the man shouting at him to stay away from the demonic spellbook. This must have been the very page from the spellbook he was talking about. He told Hernando that they were going to the Empire. Hernando stared at him incredulously and asked if he was serious. Yuri said they needed to go there anyway, adding that whatever it was, he wanted to see it with his own eyes. He then turned back to the Duchess and asked if there was a way to identify a dark magic user more clearly, rather than by obvious signs like a deformed body. The Duchess thought for a moment and said that there was one thing, but then she immediately stopped, a greedy glint in her eyes, and asked if he really expected to get an answer for free. Yuri was momentarily at a loss. The Duchess sighed dramatically and said that she was going to decipher the page and give him information about it. But it seemed she would get nothing in return for all her efforts. She reminded him that he hadn't even greeted her and had barged into the lady's room without knocking. Yuri was stricken by this verbal blow. He asked with forced calm if there was anything she wanted from him. The Duchess smiled and said, "Not right now." Then, with a gentle but clearly intent expression, she said all she needed was a promise. When the day came when she needed the favor, he must agree to do anything for her. Yuri forced a tight smile and thought that he had encountered similar situations before. He let out a dry chuckle before admitting to himself that his debt continued to accumulate. His thoughts were carried away, as if they had flown out of the building. But in front of him, Mary Rose crossed her arms over her chest and glared at him, and asked impatiently whether he intended to make a promise or not. Yuri hesitated and awkwardly stalled for time. Beside him, Hernando leaned over and whispered that if Yuri refused, she would definitely be offended. He added that her character was like fire. She loved to hold grudges, and making her angry was a terrible idea. Yuri muttered to himself that this was madness. Mary Rose caught them whispering and sharply asked what they were both mumbling about. Yuri quickly said it was nothing. After a brief pause, he sighed and gave in, promising to fulfill her every desire at the first word. Mary Rose instantly brightened and called it sweet. Now that the promise was over, Yuri said that he wanted an answer to his previous question. He asked if there was a way to recognize a dark magic user through some kind of sign that appears while casting dark spells, or through traces that remain afterward. Mary Rose hummed something under her breath and became thoughtful. A moment later, she said that there was indeed one sign. Dark mages go blind, so anyone who rapidly loses their sight immediately falls under suspicion. Yuri immediately remembered that all orcish spellcasters were blind. Hernando asked Yuri why he was interested in this now, and whether he would really go to the Empire himself. Yuri calmly replied that he had a friend there. The magician was taken aback and repeated the word friend, after which he pointed out that Yuri had never been to the Empire. Yuri said that he met the man on the outskirts of Briol, and added that he was almost certain that Hernando was also there then. Hernando stared at him incredulously and asked who he was talking about, but Yuri only smiled and said nothing. Elsewhere, in the great Zion Empire, chaos erupted in a dark alley. The two bandits shouted angrily, saying that someone dared to contact them and still thinks he can get out of there alive. In response, a mocking voice said that such a lie might work on the pampered fools of the Empire, but not on him. This was then followed by another statement that from now on the place would no longer belong to them, and to the uncle's usury branch, led by Goriot. And we saw three bastards led by a mustachioed freak. The scene changed. Later, under a bright sky, Yuri and Hernando were driving along the road toward the Empire. Hernando, in disbelief, repeated the name Goriot from Sujongru. Yuri replied that a branch of his business should have opened there by now. Hernando, however, recalled that he had thought the man dead after Yuri had squeezed him out of his money. Yuri said that Goriot might have been a con man, but he was extremely resourceful, and there was no one better than him when it came to gathering information for them. Hernando reluctantly agreed that Yuri was right. As they continued on their way, Hernando suddenly asked Yuri what he planned to do when he returned to Briol. Yuri turned around with a puzzled sound. Hernando raised his voice, asking why Yuri was pretending to be confused, and reminded him that after the war ended, everyone went home. Then he told Yuri to look back and see two men following them. Yuri looked back. Behind him rode Master Mo and another knight. Hernando said that both of these men were already famous throughout the continent, so he could easily imagine how they would demand a duel with His Majesty the very moment they returned. He expressed concern that His Majesty would destroy the entire castle if he got too excited. Yuri admitted that this was entirely possible. Despite this, he said there was nothing to worry about. He explained that Master Muyongchan still had to train him, and Bernard could stay with Sir Jose. He concluded that everything should be fine as long as they followed orders. At that moment, the soldier pointed forward and called out to Yuri. Yuri looked away and smiled, and told everyone to stop worrying and enjoy their victorious return home. Soon, the Briol Gate came into view under a shining sky filled with balloons and swirling petals. The gates opened and the city exploded with welcoming cries. As soon as the horsemen entered, voices from the crowd shouted that the valiant hero had returned. People were clapping, waving, and leaning out of windows, and the baskets of hot air balloons overhead to shower the procession with petals. Yuri rode through this celebration. Despite this, he narrowed his eyes at his soldiers and wondered why they were acting so timidly. Then he called Jard by name. Jard responded immediately. Yuri casually ordered him to go and get some flowers from the villagers. Jard froze and hesitated in disbelief, but Yuri immediately slapped him and told him to hurry up. Jard moved aside sheepishly and approached the girl holding a basket of flowers. He called out to her awkwardly, and the young lady answered him timidly. She asked if he could come a little closer. Jard leaned over and asked if it was close enough. Instead of handing him individual flowers, the girl suddenly placed a flower garland around his neck and happily thanked him for protecting them. When she called him Mr. Knight, Gerald turned completely red. Confused and stunned, he said he had only done his knightly duty. Behind him, the other soldiers stared at the scene and then burst into loud banter. They laughed, pointed at him, and shouted that he'd received flowers from the sweetest girl. Burning with shame under the garland, Gerald turned sharply and ordered them to shut up. While Gerald continued to blush, Yuri laughed at this scene. In the midst of this cheerful noise, someone called out to His Highness. At the entrance to the palace, Yuri found Sir Jaime waiting for him. Jaime greeted him informally and congratulated him on his safe return. He said he'd already heard stories about Yuri and the Allied forces. Yuri modestly replied that it was all the result of teamwork. Then Jaime said that he wanted to thank Yuri personally, so he came himself. He said that the orcs were his eternal enemies and bowed his head in gratitude, calling Yuri His Highness. Yuri watched him silently, thinking that he couldn't let this old knight spend the rest of his life chasing peace after taking his revenge. Having named Jaime Fyodor Shield of Briol, he decided to give the noble defender of the borders a worthy death in real combat. So Yuri told him his work wasn't finished. He said the day he found their true enemies would be the day Jaime would fight his final battle. Then he asked if he was still with him. Jaime immediately replied that of course he would stay. After this, Jaime thanked Yuri for his time and said that it was time for him to go inside. Yuri was informed that His Majesty and the other highnesses were already waiting for him, and he walked on with a slight smile. The official ceremony began shortly thereafter. The king stood before the crowd and said that he usually left such ceremonies to one of his sons, But not this time. He announced that their third prince, who had risked his life on the battlefield, returned with glory as a true winner. The king stood majestically on the platform. Yuri listened and thought that none of this would have been possible without those who were around him. When the king came down to him, he said that Yuri had grown morally and became even taller than before. Then his gaze shifted, and he noticed that Yuri had also brought a strange guest with him. Seeing Master Mo next to Yuri, the prince calmly said that this man would exceed all expectations. He even added that his father might lose to him. The king dismissed this idea and said that Yuri was still too young. Then the king raised his hand and shouted that the heroes who brought victory deserved everything the kingdom had. At his command, bottles began to uncork all around them. A sudden flash washed over Yuri and the crowd with splashes of sparkling wine. Yuri winced in shock as the people around him laughed and cheered. He turned to his father, who was almost dying of laughter, and asked who had planned all of this. The king laughed and said that he couldn't tell him yet. He added that the culprit asked not to be named because he did not want to hear Yuri's anger after he found out everything. The moment Yuri heard this, he realized that there was only one person capable of such a thing. He immediately shouted out brother Joshua's name. Joshua, caught red-handed with the bottle in his hands, let out a terrified cry and took off running. As he ran, he shouted that this was a welcoming ceremony, and Yuri should simply enjoy it. Nearby, his maid watched this lively scene, and I thought that just yesterday the prince was a problem child. Watching him grip his brother tightly, she said Yuri now looked stunning. The warm celebration continued around them. Then night fell. In the quiet courtyard, Yuri was suddenly hit on the head with a wooden training sword and screamed. He fell down in pain while Master Mo stood over him, and with complete calm, he said that Yuri was still too weak. Yuri glared at him, and the maid bitterly reproached her master for his lack of composure. Gripping his sword, Yuri reminded him of the agreement to duel, but clearly not on the day of the holiday. Master Mo cut him off and ordered him to be silent. He said that a swordsman must always be ready to draw his blade. Yuri asked what had happened to the duel Master Mo was supposed to have with his father. Master Mo simply replied that it had been rescheduled for tomorrow. He then declared that he would be Yuri's opponent that night, standing to the side with a calm expression. Yuri thought that there was definitely something wrong with this man, but came to the conclusion that Master Mo was probably just bored. Yuri accepted the inevitable and urged them to take the matter seriously. Master Mo grinned and demanded that Yuri demonstrate the internal energy technique. Yuri gripped his sword and allowed an aura to rise around him. Even as he gathered his strength, he grumbled that if Master Mo killed him here, he would go cry to his father. Master Mo replied without a trace of sympathy that he had never taken children as disciples. Then the two of them stood facing each other under the night sky, swords at the ready, and the duel truly began. Master Mo rushed forward first, enveloped in blazing flames, and Yuri rushed forward instead of retreating. Their swords clashed face to face, so close that their faces almost touched as sparks flew between them. Master Mo immediately launched another crushing blow, unleashing a wide arc of fire at Yuri. Yuri braced himself and blocked the blow, while the maid standing at the door winced in shock at how violent the exchange of blows had become. Clearly pleased, Master Mo said that Yuri was not bad, but added that this was clearly not all he had. Yuri, already swirling the white wind around his body and pointing his sword forward with a whirlwind, he replied that of course that was not all. As the storm intensified, Master Mo watched him, and he admitted that this technique was good. Yuri then released the first technique of the Yuri style, the swirling wind sword. A huge spiral of wind erupted forward from him, growing into a roaring whirlwind that filled the entire courtyard. Master Mo's eyes instantly sharpened. He responded with the reverse form of the Scarlet Cloud Clear Sky sword technique. The flames gathered around him in a blazing ring, and then it spun in the opposite direction, spreading through the air and digging into Yuri's stream. And then the main character began to counterattack again. Yuri immediately realized what was happening and exclaimed that Master Mo had used his own winds against him. Master Mo said that Yuri's winds were too straightforward. He added that Yuri is still far from his level, and then told him to make do with what he had. Yuri immediately flew into the air, roared, and poured even more power into the storm, and then he directed it from top to bottom, straight into his opponent, who was standing at the ready. Master Mo moved forward and activated the heavenly net form of the Scarlet Cloud Clear Sky sword technique, convinced that resistance would be pointless once the flames closed. But at that moment, the tide changed. The flames were unable to completely neutralize the main character's mana. Inside the white whirlwind, Yuri's hand began to move, and a multitude of blades began to intertwine within the wind itself. The spinning flow no longer seemed like just a technique. The sword network, hidden within the storm, cut through the fire network and disarmed Master Mo. Master Mo was visibly shocked and said he couldn't believe what he saw. Looking at Yuri's technique, he realized that this martial art was created based on the legacy of the swordsman who conquered the heavens, but also contained the martial art of a heavenly demon. Yuri grinned through the storm and said that his ancestors left him a very funny thing for training. Master Mo's blade cut icy arcs under the moonlight, leaving pale streaks in the night air. A heavy thud echoed across the ground as he gathered his strength for the next strike. Like a raging storm, he rushed forward and pointed his sword straight at Yuri with stunning speed. Yuri could only let out a terrified cry, his eyes widening at the terrifying speed of his master. Master Mo calmly praised him, even as he rose into the air for the finishing blow. Before Yuri could react properly, the sword struck him straight in the head. The blow exploded into a small burst of mana. A huge lump instantly swelled on Yuri's head, smoking slightly in the cold night air. He fell to the ground, clutching his bruise and groaning pitifully, accusing his master of going far beyond the bounds of simple training. Yuri bitterly asked if this duel had been merely a pretext for his punishment. Master Mo casually admitted that it was partly true. The prince winced helplessly, and the massive bump on his head made him look completely pathetic. Then Master Mo said that when he crossed swords with him, he finally understood what the soul-splitting sword was. Later that night, Yuri walked alone along the stone path, the dim lanterns casting a long shadow behind him. His thoughts returned to the heavenly demon his master had mentioned. The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. Based on his own understanding, Yuri came to the conclusion that the creator of this martial art most likely cast aside all moral boundaries in pursuit of absolute power. Finally, exhaustion escaped him in a heavy sigh. Not wanting these disturbing thoughts to ruin his rest, he collapsed onto the soft grass. It had been a long time since he had felt such peace, free from the endless intrigues, swords, and battlefields. He gazed silently at the shining stars as the cool breeze of his homeland caressed his skin. Yuri wondered silently if he had truly changed for the better. A warm voice suddenly replied that, of course he had. Startled by surprise, Yuri immediately jumped up in alarm and looked at the figure standing nearby. The moment he recognized Cedric's soft smile, relief washed over him. Cedric explained that he was just passing by the garden when he noticed Yuri resting and decided to take a look. Sitting down next to his younger brother, he noticed that the palace had recently been filled with laudatory speeches about Yuri's achievements. Embarrassed by the praise, Yuri awkwardly scratched the back of his head and gave a shy smile. Cedric burst out laughing and teased that he could hardly recognize in this hard-working young man the troublesome younger brother he once knew. He gently ruffled Yuri's hair with his warm hand. Cedric said proudly that Yuri worked incredibly hard and that he truly admired him. Yuri closed his eyes silently, enjoying the rare comfort of brotherly affection as a strange lightness spread through his chest. Yuri casually asked how things had been going in his absence. Cedric replied that he was still doing just as usual, but Joshua was trying his hand at something new. Yuri immediately looked worried and asked if Joshua had done anything stupid again. Cedric laughed quietly and explained that Joshua was different. On the contrary, he has recently become unusually diligent, immersing himself in government affairs and trade issues. Yuri suddenly remembered Joshua's bold declaration about protecting the palace. It seemed that promise hadn't been empty boasting at all. Cedric laughed warmly and admitted that having such reliable younger brothers made him optimistic about the kingdom's future. Yuri sincerely replied that Cedric himself was a truly wonderful person. As they gazed at the magnificent Briol castle, shining in the moonlight, Yuri quietly admitted that he looked forward to the day when Cedric himself would one day lead the kingdom. Then, with a barely noticeable smile, Cedric started talking about Yuri's upcoming visit. He said that he would go to the Empire after the affairs in the kingdom were settled. Raising an eyebrow playfully, Cedric asked if Yuri wanted to know a little secret. For once, the usually imperturbable prince looked strangely shy, and his face flushed slightly. Yuri almost froze in shock when Cedric revealed that he was dating someone connected to the imperial royal family. Cedric happily explained that they first met during the last royal ball. Hearing this, Yuri immediately reacted violently, and his thoughts immediately switched to Catherine. Confused by the force of Yuri's reaction, Cedric clarified that Katerina was only the cousin of the woman in question. He also explained that her name was Katrina, and they continued to exchange letters after the ball. He also praised her intelligence. Cedric invited Yuri to meet her during his trip to the Empire. Believing that this meeting would bring him great benefit, Yuri smiled gratefully and admitted that he would remain eternally indebted to his brother for such care. Cedric then asks slyly if Yuri really had feelings for Princess Catherine. It was worth him mentioning the rumors about affairs and complicated love triangles, and how Yuri was first with the princess of the Holy Kingdom, and now he switched to the princess of the Empire, as Yuri almost exploded from disappointment and annoyance. Tugging furiously at his hair, he insisted that he had no interest in them, and that the gossip was complete nonsense. Having vented his irritation, Yuri let out a long, exhausted sigh. He firmly stated that at the moment he had absolutely no interest in anything resembling love. Cedric just smiled at his stubborn little brother, feeling like he now understood Yuri's character a little better. Silently gazing at the night sky, Cedric thought to himself that men like Yuri would undoubtedly break countless girls' hearts in the future. By the next morning, Briel's palace was already filled with noise, namely the sharp sounds of wooden swords colliding. The knights trained tirelessly, and every blow carried with it fierce precision and unwavering determination. Dry blows echoed every now and then as the blades clashed. Yuri fell to the ground and immediately began to devour a huge piece of meat, not caring at all about royal etiquette. Standing next to him, Jard looked completely stunned that the prince still retained the rough eating habits he had developed on the battlefield. Chewing noisily, Yuri casually asked the knight about his current assignment. He responded, surprisingly, that he had recently been transferred to the prince's personal guard. Yuri almost choked on his food at this news, and Jared, seeing this reaction, asked, "Is he underestimating him?" Yuri immediately burst out laughing and explained that he was simply worried whether he would be skilled enough to keep up with him. Their cheerful conversation was abruptly interrupted when Yuri suddenly heard someone call his name from behind. Yenna approached and reminded him that it was time to receive the arriving nobles. Yuri immediately groaned in frustration. When the prince tried to slip away, the girl desperately begged him to at least look at the guest list this time. Yuri reluctantly took the folded parchment, planning only to skim through it. However, the moment he opened it, his gaze suddenly caught a familiar name, and his expression instantly changed. Yuri immediately rose to his feet and ordered Ina to begin preparations, because he had changed his mind. A barely perceptible knowing smile appeared on his lips after he discovered that one of the allied soldiers was among the arriving guests. They had fought side by side. Meanwhile, at the city gates, a man in a cloak was loudly arguing with the guards, demanding immediate access to Prince Yuri. Although the guards insisted on proper reception procedures, the stranger desperately shouted that the matter was too urgent to delay. He reported grim news. Sir Raymond had been thrown into the dungeon, seriously wounded, and in urgent need of rescue. Under the rays of the sun, the towering fortress appeared calm from the outside, but within its walls, turmoil was brewing. The richly dressed nobleman viciously kicked the thin man who lay helplessly on the stone floor. The battered victim turned out to be Fidz, who could only cover his head as he endured the brutal blows. The nobleman cursed him incessantly, angrily shouting that Fidz was a burden and should give up his turn to see Yuri immediately. Despite his swollen face and broken glasses, Fidz forced himself to his feet and insisted that he needed to see Prince Yuri. The mention of Yuri's name only further angered the nobleman. He viciously kicked Fidz right in the face and angrily complained that a nobleman like himself should never stand in the same ranks with commoners. The man tore his hair out furiously, venting his frustration that someone as insignificant as the third prince himself had dared to irritate him. Even as he lay prostrate on the floor, Fidz still defended his master's honor after hearing the nobleman insult the third prince. Rising to his feet with difficulty and pain, Fidz demanded through clenched teeth that the insult be taken back. The nobleman grinned mockingly and declared that every story about the famous war hero was nothing more than made-up nonsense. The nobleman stared at him incredulously, unable to understand how the man he had beaten almost to the point of unconsciousness could. He still found the courage to look back at him. A powerful pressure emanated silently from Fidz, as he declared that he would no longer hold back if Yuri Briel continued to be insulted. Humiliated and enraged, the nobleman roared again with the cry of an offended girl, and he grabbed Fidz by the collar and prepared to hit him again. Then he suddenly froze. A calm, unhurried voice came from right behind them, declaring that their relationship was closer than family. The nobleman turned around in shock. Yuri Briel himself appeared, literally shining with his coolness. Yuri calmly explained that he and Fidz were comrades who had endured countless hardships together on the battlefield. He stepped forward without hesitation and placed his hand on Fidz's shoulder, greeting him warmly as an old comrade. The arrogant nobles nearby instantly turned pale and began to sweat nervously the moment they realized who they had beaten. Yuri simply smiled softly and stated that he had personally come to see Fids off. Later that night, when the castle had finally quieted down, Yuri sat with Fids in the luxurious reception room. Looking at the bandages covering the veteran's battered face, Yuri asked why he had allowed himself to be beaten like that. Half-jokingly, Yuri reminded him that he had already taught him the art of hitting and running, so there was no reason to silently endure the bullying. The boy lowered his head silently. Yuri quickly got to the main point. Fee asked Gigi if he remembered the Veterans Association formed after the war. Yuri said of course he did, since he founded it. Fids explained that thanks to Yuri's compensation fund, many soldiers' families now suffered much less than before. However, his expression darkened as he revealed a serious problem. Local lords began to profit from the situation by taxing the compensation money itself. Yuri was frozen in disbelief when he learned that more than half of the aid intended for needy families was simply stolen. He quietly explained that these funds came from his own personal fortune, secretly donated through the Elaine Merchant Guild. For political reasons, Yuri could not publicly reveal that the third prince possessed such enormous wealth. He quickly realized that the nobles were abusing this secrecy as an excuse for illegal taxation. After listening carefully, Yuri nodded slowly and decided that this matter would be settled before his departure to the Empire. Fids hesitated before adding that there was another serious problem associated with the region suffering from the worst exploitation. He explained that oppression there had reached incredible levels, and that Sir Raymond had been arrested after attempting to protest directly to the managing lord. Yuri's expression instantly hardened. He asked if Eugius was the culprit, his eyes turning cold. Fils was surprised he knew this kingdom. He said that he had quite a few memories associated with this lord. In Yuri's past life, Jernar Jatari was a treacherous scoundrel who willingly fawned over the empire for his own gain. It looks like he'll have to meet that bastard again after a long time. After some time, Yuri looked towards the castle gates, deciding that one more purge was necessary before leaving for the empire. Ina asked anxiously if he really needed to leave in such a hurry, especially when he had just returned. Yuri nodded firmly and explained that such issues needed to be resolved as quickly as possible. Ina looked at him with concern. Lately, she felt like her prince had grown up too quickly, and it was making her uneasy. Seeing the expression on her face, Yuri just smiled awkwardly and teased her, asking if she couldn't just praise him for looking cooler. Ina looked at him skeptically for a moment, and then asked why he was taking only 2 companions with him. Yuri explained that traveling with too many people would attract unnecessary attention and ruin the plan. Accepting this logic, Ina gave a short laugh. She said that even with a few companions, he would still stand out. Then she fumbled in her pocket and told him to take something for protection. It was a magical relic. Ina explained that if he channeled mana into it, he could slightly alter his appearance. Yuri accepted the necklace with the shining blue crystal with a grateful smile, touched by her concern. He mounted his horse and prepared to leave the castle. Yuri waved goodbye to Ina and then urged his horse forward, while the 2 knights followed closely behind him. Ina straightened her hair and silently watched the departing prince, her eyes full of both pride and endless anxiety. She silently prayed that he would complete his journey safely and return soon. After some time, the riders were racing along the paths, dust rising from under the horses' hooves. Riding deeper into the forest, Sir Jard nervously asked about the danger of the mountain path. Yuri replied that, with Raymond imprisoned, they had no choice but to hurry. Jard muttered anxiously that they might be ambushed. Yuri laughed and replied that it would be a great chance for the guards to show off their skills. Seeing how careless his master was, Jard let out a long sigh and complained that Yuri should not have brought danger upon them so carelessly. Meanwhile, the blonde knight next to them looked at Yuri with almost fanatical admiration, as if gazing at an idol. Moved almost to tears, he declared that this must be part of Yuri's great plan to give them the opportunity to appreciate the beauty of their homeland. Jard continued to warn them that such loud driving noise would make them easy targets for bandits hiding nearby. At that very moment, movement was heard in the tree branches. Even before his warning was fully completed, arrows pierced the dense canopy and flew towards the group with terrifying speed. One arrow flew straight at Yuri, making the danger imminent. Yuri sensed it instantly. Without hesitation, he gripped his sword and prepared to counterattack. A flash of steel shot up, knocking down all the flying arrows in an instant. Yuri smiled confidently and said that everything happened exactly as Jard feared, so there was no way they could have missed it. From the shadows, bandits began to surround them. The real battle was about to begin. As Yuri's squad advanced through the forest, a group of armed men blocked their path. Their shaggy, bearded leader raised his sword and demanded payment if they wanted to pass. Pointing at Laurent, the leader mocked him as a pale young gentleman with a couple of servants. He was delighted, anticipating easy prey. Standing behind Laurent, Yuri and Jard felt anger boiling within them. Being mistaken for servants was an insult they could not ignore. The bandit laughed loudly and ordered them to give up everything they owned if they did not want to be beaten. Yuri's irritation finally showed. He tugged at his hair with a dangerous smile. He ordered Laurent to deal with them. Laurent immediately drew his sword and rushed to the attack. The bandit leader flinched, not expecting the so-called young master to move with the speed of a true knight. He quickly raised his weapon to block. Their blades collided with a thunderous crack, raising dust under their feet. The bandit's eyes narrowed as he realized he had chosen a difficult opponent. Sparks flew with every collision as Laurent advanced with sharp, relentless blows. But Laurent himself was surprised as his opponent parried every attack with his usual ease. Watching from the side, Jard noticed to Yuri that the man's foundations were extremely strong. Yuri nodded, saying that judging by his movements, this man had clearly survived countless real battles. Yuri's eyes narrowed as he began to suspect who these supposed forest bandits really were. Laurent struck the decisive blow. His blade slashed across the enemy's armor. A wide rip opened across the leader's chest, revealing an old X-shaped scar beneath the fabric. Everyone was ready to finish the fight, but Yuri suddenly ordered them to stop. Both men instantly froze. Yuri slowly stepped forward and said that there was no need to continue. Pointing to the scar, he stated that these men were soldiers from the previous generation of the Union Army. The bandit leader turned pale when he noticed the color of Yuri's hair, and his face distorted with shock. Yuri smiled faintly and confirmed that he was Briol's son. The old man froze as realization dawned on him, and the tense atmosphere dissipated. Yuri asked point-blank why such respectable veterans as they had descended to robbery. The old leader sank heavily to the ground and laughed bitterly. He explained that after the war ended, life became hell for ordinary soldiers like them. The nobles oppressed them, raised taxes, and fabricated false charges against them to deprive them of their merits. He said he spent his life with a sword in his hand, protecting people. But once his own family was on the brink of disaster, he simply had no other choice. Yuri listened to this in silence, then nodded slightly. He understood their pain. He ordered them to disband their bandit camp and head straight to Yuji's domain. He firmly promised that veterans would receive the fair treatment they deserved. By evening, the gates of Yuji's domain loomed under the darkening sky. Thanks to Ina's relic, Yuri entered the city disguised as a brown-haired man. They had barely passed through the gate when they encountered an arrogant guard who openly demanded a bribe. Yuri looked around coldly. The city turned out to be even more rotten than he expected. When they reached the square, they found a crowd of people loudly protesting. Posters were raised, declaring Sir Raymond's innocence and demanding his release. Yuri learned that those who rose up to protest were veterans. He decided to approach the crowd and find out the whole story. He asked the guards to explain what had happened to Sir Raymond. The irritated guard said that he didn't know Yuri and ridiculed him for looking like an effeminate nobleman. Yuri decided to drop his disguise. The magical glow faded from him. With a haughty smile, he called the guards idiots and revealed his true identity. A shocked guard asked him when he had arrived at Yugi's domain. Yuri casually replied that he had just arrived. The guard immediately apologized for calling the prince a pampered son, although Yuri still looked slightly hurt by the insults. Putting this trivial matter aside, Yuri ordered them to explain what exactly was happening. The commander became agitated, explaining that their aid funds were being ruthlessly taxed under the pretext that the origin of the money was unclear. After this, veterans were treated as criminals, despite the fact that they had risked their lives for the Union Army. Because Sir Raymond tried to stand up for his comrades, he was thrown into prison. Yuri fell silent, processing what he had just heard. He then declared that returning the money would be easy and that he would send people from the Merchant Guild to help. The soldiers were deeply grateful. Yet Yuri could not understand why Lord Gennard would go so far as to make veterans suffer. Laurent, who was standing next to him, also sensed something was wrong and volunteered to conduct an investigation personally. Yuri stopped him with a smile and said that Laurent had no need to interfere, as he already had a plan. He told Laurent and Jard to stay put and protect the people while he attended to other important matters. Yuri confidently said that he knew exactly who was best suited for this investigation. Then he walked through the streets alone, seeing poor townspeople begging everywhere. His target was a magnificent tower known as the Crystal Pavilion, or Sujongru. As he entered, Yuri raised his hand in an extremely familiar greeting, as if he had returned to a place he knew well. The Crystal Pavilion branch manager was stunned to see the prince suddenly appear in Yuji. Yuri got straight to the point and said he wanted to know the truth behind Lord Junard's actions. He felt that Junard's arrogance was about more than just money. The branch manager thought carefully, and then remembered a suspicious incident that had happened recently. He explained that one of the Lord's trusted aides had secretly brought the guests into the pavilion and requested a completely private room. What stood out was that these guests were nobles from the empire. Yuri narrowed his eyes in surprise. The manager admitted he couldn't remember the exact time, but said the meeting was extremely strange. It took place around the time the Allied forces were collapsing. Yuri considered this, realizing that the situation was becoming much more interesting than expected. Later, Yuri walked along the dark alleys of Yugs, unaware that someone was watching him from the shadows. His thoughts turned to the intrigues of the empire. He remembered his past life, when the kingdom of Briol fell, and Junard Jatari immediately switched sides, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Yuri's gaze hardened as he wondered if this bastard had colluded with the enemy even before the war began. As he continued walking, a shy little flower seller suddenly ran up and blocked his path. She smiled brightly and held out a rose, offering to sell it to him. A little surprised, Yuri pointed to himself to confirm that she meant him. Then he looked to the side and noticed suspicious men loitering at the entrance to the alley and watching closely what was happening. His expression turned cold as he realized that the child was being forced to work. Both men stood hidden in the shadows, watching everything that was happening. Yuri felt disgust for people who exploited everyone for personal gain. He realized that Ujis was much worse than he had imagined. Suppressing his anger, Yuri smiled softly at the girl and decided to buy a flower. He handed her the coin, and the child stared at his palm in surprise. She realized uncomfortably that he had paid much more than was required, and then quickly thanked him for his generosity. Taking this opportunity, Yuri asked if she knew anything about Sir Raymond. From her, he learned that Raymond was to be brought to public trial simply because the Lord hated him. Clutching the basket tightly, the girl insisted that the knight was an extremely kind man. As tears welled up in her eyes, she explained that Raymond had once given her starving brothers and sisters a piece of bread when they were suffering terribly. Yuri gently placed his hand on the girl's head to comfort her. He assured her that everything would be fine and told her to go home early to her brother. Yuri watched the little flower seller run off into the distance and then was left alone on the silent street. Anger burned in his eyes as he mentally vowed that this time he would completely crush Junard Jatari. The next day, the execution square was packed with people. The guillotine, ominously erected on the platform, stood as a grim warning to anyone who dared to oppose the Lord. Raymond knelt in chains on a wooden scaffold, his face expressing exhaustion and resignation to fate. Hidden in the crowd under disguise, Yuri calmly watched the Lord's display of power. The guillotine towered over the crowd, intimidating everyone present. The gavel slammed down hard on the table, silencing the crowd. The judge began reading the charges, calling Raymond a disgraced former knight. A murmur spread through the crowd, and Yuri's guards could barely contain their anger at the obvious slander. The official loudly listed one false accusation after another, including tax evasion and bribery, all intended to tarnish Raymond's honor. Yuri said nothing, silently watching the absurd spectacle being staged by corrupt officials. When it was finally the defense's turn to express its position, then the lawyer cowardly bowed his head and said that he could not defend the accused. People immediately began shouting protests, convinced that Sir Raymond was innocent. As the crowd grew heated, the guards closed ranks and pushed back the townspeople with shields to protect the place of execution. Then Junard Jatari took the platform and loudly declared that the trial had been completely fair. He invited anyone who disagreed to speak. The ordinary townspeople exchanged frightened glances. Under the pressure of the Lord's soldiers, no one dared raise their voices. Seeing their silence, a malicious smile spread across Girner's plump face. He coldly announced that everyone had admitted Sir Raymond's guilt. People could only look at each other helplessly as their last hope for justice faded away. Girner signaled the judge to announce the verdict. At that moment, a loud voice from the crowd called him a bastard to his face. Girner froze in disbelief, unable to accept that someone had dared to insult him so openly. Still under disguise, Yuri curled his lips in disdain and asked if this was really how Girner had been managing his domain all this time. He added a caustic remark about Gernard's incompetence, which caused Lord's face to flush with shame. A soldier standing nearby drew his sword and shouted, demanding to know how Yuri dared to insult the Lord. In the blink of an eye, several blades rushed towards Yuri and his companions, making the situation dangerously tense. Yuri didn't even flinch. A cold glint flashed in his eyes, causing alarm to appear on Gernad's face as sweat trickled down his skin. The aggressive guard moved to attack, but Gernad sensed something was wrong and hastily ordered him to stop. At that moment, Yuri's necklace glowed a bright blue. He warned them that drawing a blade against him would be considered treason. The disguise faded, revealing the true face of third Prince Yuri Briol. Yuri strode toward the scaffold with absolute confidence. Upon seeing him, Gernad was frozen with shock, while Yuri declared that the situation here was even worse than he expected. The crowd began to murmur in amazement at the prince's appearance. Yuri announced that the relief supplies were a royal gift, personally delivered to the veterans. He then declared that all the accusations against Raymond were completely groundless. Raymond slowly raised his head and looked at Yuri with eyes full of newfound hope. Gernad fell to the ground in horror, staring at Yuri as if a demon appeared before him. Yuri growled that Gernad should stop torturing innocent people and vomit out every coin of the money he had embezzled from his fat belly. That night, after the chaos in the square had finally died down, a quiet calm returned to the estate. Yuri exhaled quietly, finally having the opportunity to sit down and rest. The blonde knight next to him praised the prince for everything he had done that day. He reported that Sir Raymond was receiving intensive medical care, and although he had been in captivity for a long time, his life was no longer in danger. The knight then asked what they would do next, as the matter would clearly not end there. Yuri nodded and suggested that Gernad was probably trying his best to erase any traces of his embezzlement. He said he intended to appoint Raymond as head of the Veterans Association because Raymond understood the suffering of veterans better than anyone else and had the compassion to lead them. As for old Gernad, Yuri revealed that he had already sent a master to deal with him. At that very moment, inside the Lord's castle, a purple-haired female assassin was secretly entering the building. She squatted outside the balcony and watched the room through the window. Inside, she discovered hidden chests filled to the brim with gold and silver. Then she saw old Gernad kneeling before a magical sphere of communication that was glowing with a strange blue light. Gernad reported in a panic to the person on the other end of the line, explaining that the third prince had unexpectedly intervened. Drenched in sweat, he stuttered, apologizing and promising that he would still sort everything out according to plan. The assassin narrowed her eyes and carefully moved closer, trying to determine who exactly was giving orders to Gernad. Suddenly, the voice from the sphere became colder, as if sensing something unusual in the air. A mysterious figure warned Gernad that a rat was hiding outside the window. The assassin froze. It had been discovered. This word sent a shudder through Gernad. He rushed to the window, his movements tense and frantic. Breathing heavily, he pulled back the curtains and looked outside, but there was no one there. Only the cold night wind blew past the castle walls. Seeing nothing, Gernad informed the magical sphere in a trembling voice that there was no one outside. The person on the other end didn't look convinced. Instead, he coldly stated that Gernad's time was up. In a threatening voice, he warned that there would be no next time. These words struck Gernad like a blade. With trembling hands, he said he would remember this, and fear was clearly visible on his face. After the communication session ended, frustration and rage instantly overwhelmed him. Cursing everyone around him for his misfortunes, he flew out of the room, completely unaware that someone was still watching him from the darkness. Asuna remained hidden in the shadows, silently observing everything. When Gernad finally left, she slipped silently into the room. Looking around quickly and carefully, she checked the situation to make sure no one was left inside. Then her gaze fell on the communication sphere left on the table. Asuna slowly approached it and carefully picked it up. Squinting, she examined the sphere carefully, hoping to discern who it was connected to. Asuna intended to bring the sphere back to Prince Yuri as proof, but before she could do anything else, the sphere suddenly flared with a bright light. She shuddered in alarm. Tiny cracks began to spread across its surface. Her expression tightened as she immediately realized something was wrong. The next moment, the entire room was engulfed in a blinding light. A powerful explosion rocked the room where Asuna was. Meanwhile, in the mansion where Yuri was staying, the lights were on, despite the late hour. The atmosphere inside was tense and uneasy. Yuri stood quietly by the window, waiting for Asuna to return, wondering why she was late. Suddenly, someone called out to him. It was Asuna. Yuri's eyes widened in shock as he turned around. Asuna had crawled through the window, clutching a stack of documents tightly to her chest. She was in terrible shape, her face bruised, her body covered in wounds, and her clothes covered in dust and burn marks. As she entered, she stumbled, but Yuri rushed forward and caught her. He carefully held her and laid her down on the sofa, his face darkening as he saw how badly she was hurt. Yuri worriedly asked if she was okay. Asuna nodded weakly and replied that she was just a little tired. Despite her wounds, she immediately began reporting what had happened. She explained that she had found a communication sphere, but it had exploded before she could bring it back. Handing Yuri the documents she'd retrieved from the Duke, Asuna received a nod and a thank you. Softening his tone, he ordered her to treat her wounds and promised to call for medical help. Asuna's exhausted eyes softened. Yuri gently placed his hand on her head and told her to rest for a bit, adding that she had done well. Hearing this, Asuna smiled faintly, despite her injuries. After a short time, Yuri left the room and found Jard waiting outside. Jard immediately asked if the informant had been injured. Yuri confirmed it, explaining that the enemy had prepared everything in advance, but fortunately, her wounds were not fatal. Then Yuri placed his hand on Jard's shoulder and ordered him to get ready immediately, as they were going to meet Junard. The atmosphere in Duke Junard's castle became stiflingly tense. The food prepared for Yuri had already been pushed aside. In a threatening voice, Yuri asked Junard if he really thought Yuri was there just to enjoy a meal, and his cold tone echoed heavily throughout the room. Jard and Laurent stood silently behind him, like motionless guards. Holding up the documents, Yuri declared he had no intention of letting any of this slide. He warned Junard to think carefully before answering his questions. Then, Yuri placed the documents on the table and began the interrogation. Seeing the papers laid out, Junard turned deathly pale and panicked. Yuri coldly added that these documents contained all the evidence of his corruption. However, he promised leniency for minor offenses, provided they cooperated properly. Leaning forward, Yuri asked point-blank about any connection to the Empire, which Junard quickly, but trembling with fear, denied. Sweat poured down his face as he explained that, as Duke of Briol, it was only natural for him to have connections with several imperial officials. Yuri's expression remained unchanged. With sharp, pressing eyes, he asked again if this was really all. Yuri's sharp slam on the table echoed through the room, causing everything to shake. He cut Junard off sternly, noting that he hadn't come here for excuses. Then he released his aura. A crushing pressure filled the room, making the very air feel heavy. Junard's entire body went rigid under the force. Yuri coldly ordered him to tell the truth about why the Empire was targeting the Alliance Veterans Association. Junard gritted his teeth and began to mutter nervously, his eyes trembling as fear overtook him. After a few moments of agonizing, he finally muttered that he had nothing more to say. Silence fell over the room. Yuri stared at him in silence. He then slowly gathered up the scattered documents and asked if Junard really intended to behave in this manner. He said Junard must have taken the law's observance as a joke. Yuri added that once Junard was thrown into Briol's underground prison, the luxurious life he enjoyed would become nothing more than a distant memory. Even hearing this, Junard remained silent. Yuri smiled faintly and calmly stated that the choice had been made, but they would get to the bottom of the truth, no matter what. Turning to leave, Yuri declared that he would personally go to the Empire and get to the bottom of the truth. Junard remained standing, frozen in shock. Before closing the door, Yuri left a final warning. He told Junard not to make any futile attempts and to remain still. In the hallway, Jard and Laurent silently followed Yuri. After walking a short distance, Jard asked if he was letting Junard go so easily, to which Yuri calmly replied in the affirmative. Laurent noted grimly that, given the Duke's countless crimes, he could not be released, even if someone truly powerful stood behind him. Understanding their doubts, Yuri asked what would happen to Yugis if he punished Junard right now. Laurent fell silent, unable to answer. Yuri explained that someone would still have to manage Yugis while they were gone. Even so, it wasn't as if they hadn't learned anything from the situation. Laurent looked shocked. Yuri continued seriously, saying that the fact that Junard was afraid of someone even more than imprisonment, proving the presence of a larger-than-life figure supporting him from the shadows, Jard and Laurent finally understood Yuri's plan. Yuri smiled ominously and urged them not to worry about managing Yugis, planning to significantly expand the role of the Alliance Veterans Association. The Alliance Veterans Association was subsequently entrusted to Sir Raymond, along with the responsibility of keeping an eye on Junard. They were also made responsible for the reintegration and well-being of veterans throughout the region. Thanks to these reforms, the people of Yugis gradually regained the ability to live like normal people again. Stability slowly returned to the city after a long period of suffering. Romer also eventually joined the Alliance Veterans Association. There, he reunited with his old comrades and began to return to normal life, finally leaving his days as a bandit behind. Meanwhile, Yuri, Jard, and Laurent left Yuga's as soon as the situation calmed down. Jard was surprised that Romer was Raymond's comrade, but Yuri noted his skills. Jard admitted that without the aura, he wouldn't have considered him a knight. Yuri pointed out that Romer had a massive scar on his chest, meaning his core had likely been damaged during the war. Laurent immediately praised Romer, and then added that Yuri, as expected, was remarkable for having noticed all this in such a short time. Ignoring the admiration, Yuri urged them to return quickly for preparations, now that the association's affairs had been settled. Laurent was surprised and asked if they were leaving immediately. Yuri looked towards the distant horizon and smiled faintly. Then, in a calm but serious voice, he announced that from now on, they would be heading to the Granzan Empire. As Yuri looked ahead, the Granzan Empire slowly loomed ahead. Yuri practically exploded with delight, announcing that they had finally reached the Empire. Having endured such a long journey, he enthusiastically declared that they had finally arrived at their destination. However, his companions didn't share this level of enthusiasm. Jard moaned that the trip had been too long and insisted he never wanted to experience anything like it again. Freund, on the other hand, looked thrilled with joy. Laughing loudly, he clapped Hernando on the back and asked if Sir Hernando hadn't found the trip exciting either. Hernando glanced at Yuri and dryly suggested that His Highness consider using the proper road the next time they set out. Yuri immediately asked why. Hernando glanced back silently and pointed to Corey, who was bent over and vomiting incessantly. He added that this had clearly not been a pleasant journey for Corey. Only then did Yuri notice Corey's condition and asked if Corey was okay. Corey forced himself to reply that he was fine. A satisfied Yuri cheerfully declared that all their suffering would ultimately be worth it. After all, they were personally invited by the Emperor himself. As the massive gates swung open, the heart of the Empire lay before them. Laurent's eyes widened as he exclaimed that the sight was incredible. Jard also looked around in amazement and noticed that everything was astonishing. Watching the two of them gaze at the city with open admiration, Yuri explained that the imperial capital was gathering wealth from all corners of the continent. Given this, her magnificence was entirely natural. He then reminded them that they were representatives of Briol and should not allow themselves to become intimidated. After walking a bit, Yuri suddenly wondered if someone should be waiting to receive them. At that very moment, a voice rang out from afar. The young man ran up to them, breathing heavily. When he reached them, he apologized profusely for being late. Adjusting his clothes, he confidently introduced himself as Dale Evers of the Briol Alumni Association. Yuri repeated the name in surprise and asked about this association. Jard admitted he'd never heard of such an organization before. Scratching the back of his head awkwardly, Dale explained that it was a group formed by people from Briol, especially those who came to the Empire to study. When the introductions were over, Dale turned and offered to take them to their accommodations. As Dale walked ahead, Jard leaned closer to Yuri and quietly remarked that the man looked rather suspicious. Yuri calmly replied that one shouldn't judge people by their appearance. However, he himself had already noticed something unusual. A faint, sweet scent wafted around Dale. Yuri wondered if he was imagining it. After some time, they finally reached their destination. Dale proudly pointed to a luxurious hotel and announced that this was where they would be staying. Leading them inside, he explained that the establishment belonged to an imperial count and was renowned for its service. The luxurious interior immediately left Jard speechless. Dale then handed each of them a large gold key. He explained that the group had shared rooms, while Yuri will receive a separate private apartment. He added that the room has a great view. Taking Yuri's luggage, Dale politely offered to carry it for him. Yuri accepted the offer and thanked him. As Dale escorted Yuri upstairs, he remarked that his arrival had caused a stir in the entire alumni association. When Yuri questioned him, his companion replied that he had become famous throughout the Empire. Reaching the room, Dale put down his luggage and informed Yuri that this was his apartment. He added that Yuri only needed to call if he needed anything. Feeling exhausted from the journey, Yuri pushed the door and thought that he should tidy himself up before getting some rest. Then he caught a familiar scent. His head instantly snapped up. At that very moment, someone came out of the bathroom. Yuri's eyes widened as he recognized the scent. Lily appeared wrapped in a bath towel, still unaware of the situation. Their eyes met. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Lily realized what was happening. She let out a loud scream. Yuri froze, as if struck by lightning. Immediately covering his face and turning away, he exclaimed in shock that this room should have belonged to him, and demanded to know what had happened. Regaining some composure, he quickly apologized. He explained that he had been given a key to this room and assumed there had been some mistake. He assured her that he would immediately ask for another room. Before he could finish, Lily interrupted him. She asked if he really intended to just apologize and leave, as if nothing had happened. Yuri froze instantly. Completely misinterpreting her words, he instinctively covered himself and mentally wondered what this even meant. After Lily finished dressing, the two of them sat down for a serious conversation. Returning to the topic, Yuri cautiously asked if she should hold him accountable for the body he'd seen. Lily calmly replied that guilt wasn't important, since the fact remained a fact. Looking embarrassed, she explained that she didn't mean anything dramatic. She simply wanted compensation. She then explained that there was a place she would like to visit, but it was difficult for a woman to go there alone. Yuri asked directly where exactly she wanted to go. Without hesitation, Lily revealed that it was the greatest casino on the continent, the Regressed Casino. Then she asked if he was interested. To her surprise, Yuri stood up abruptly and firmly stated that they should go together. Sometime later, they arrived at the casino. A staff member warmly welcomed them to the continent's greatest casino, Regressed Casino. Noticing that Yuri was looking around the establishment, Lily politely expressed her gratitude for his hospitality. The clerk glanced at Yuri and noticed that since he was accompanied by such a beautiful lady, he can ask for a separate room without embarrassment if he wants. At first, Yuri didn't pay much attention to this. However, the moment he heard the words about a private room, his expression changed. His gaze shifted to the entrance, where the edge of a black robe was visible. Without hesitation, Yuri ordered the clerk to immediately escort them to a separate room. Both Lily and the clerk were visibly surprised. However, the clerk quickly complied and offered to show them to the best of the available rooms. Outside, a mysterious figure noticed the sudden change of plans and reacted as well. The man immediately followed them. In the room, Lily teasingly asked him what had gotten into him. She admitted that she had previously thought Yuri had no interest in her at all. Sitting languidly on the bed with a smug look, she commented that he could be unexpectedly assertive. Yuri calmly explained that he only wanted the room itself. He explained that the entire private room was equipped with magical devices to protect against disturbances. Meanwhile, an invisible figure was already lurking nearby. Suddenly, he turned around. In one movement, he found himself right in front of the man tracking them. He calmly asked if he was right. Before the man could react, Yuri grabbed him by the collar. He dragged him into the room and threw him inside. To everyone's surprise, the intruder turned out to be Dale. Yuri coldly noted that they had met again. He claimed he'd known it would be Dale all along. Step by step, Yuri approached him. His voice remained calm, and he stated that Dale seemed to be plotting something suspicious. Yuri demanded the truth immediately. The friendliness that had previously appeared on his face had completely evaporated. A chilling, murderous intent had appeared in his file. He warned Dale that he wasn't in the mood for much patience just yet. The scene changed. Some time passed. In the casino, Dale was shaking from the suffocating pressure, sweating profusely. Mustering up his courage, he asked how Yuri had noticed he was being followed, to which Yuri casually inquired if it mattered now. Yuri sat on Dale, who was standing in a plank, and imbued the dagger with aura. The blade flared with yellow flame, illuminating the room with an ominous heat and causing the captive to tremble even more intensely. The main character lowered the burning dagger to Dale's neck and calmly informed him that he should answer the questions first, as Yuri was extremely tired. Dale instantly broke out in an even heavier sweat. Horrified, he quickly revealed that the president had ordered him to do this. Yuri asked who exactly this president was. Dale quickly replied that he meant the president of the Briol Association. Yuri immediately demanded his name. This question frightened Dale even more. Simply put, the very name seemed to terrify him. After a moment of agonizing, he finally managed to squeeze out an answer. He revealed it was Got Barkvar. Yuri looked genuinely surprised. Got's face appeared in Yuri's mind. However, Gigi quickly regained his composure and calmly asked if Got had ordered Yuri to be taken away. Breathing heavily from both fear and exhaustion, Dale replied that it seemed Got himself was also receiving orders from someone else. The pink-haired girl noted that she suspected Got of being the source of the orders. Dale agreed, adding that he had been acting completely different lately. Hearing this, Yuri wondered if someone, or perhaps something, was manipulating Got. His thoughts drifted back to the past. He remembered the boy he once knew. As far as Yuri knew, Got had lived a quite decent life since then. Yet Yuri's expression darkened. He muttered that perhaps human nature and destiny never truly change. Having said this, Yuri finally rose from Dale's back. He ordered Dale to lead the way. The overwhelming pressure instantly vanished. Finally freed, Dale collapsed to the floor, nodding quickly. He knew he had no choice. Meanwhile, Yuri had already decided that speculation and rumors were worthless. If he wanted to know the truth, he would see it with his own eyes. Soon after, Yuri and Dale arrived at the massive mansion, just as the sun was about to set. Yuri examined the mansion carefully and asked if Gott was staying here. Dale confirmed that it was. The moment Yuri focused his gaze on the estate, a feeling of unease overcame him. Something was wrong. A strange energy hovered around the mansion. It floated through the air like an invisible veil, enveloping the entire property, as if protecting it from the outside world. Yuri's expression instantly hardened. Turning back, he ordered Dale to step aside. Without hesitation, Yuri began gathering mana. A white, glowing, smoke-like aura enveloped his body as the power surged forth. Then, with one explosive movement, Yuri delivered a powerful kick. The entrance to the mansion exploded inward. The heavy doors shattered into countless pieces. Without breaking stride, Yuri stepped inside and immediately called out Gott's name. Not wanting to be left alone outside, Dale hurried after him. In another part of the mansion, Gott instantly heard the voice. A distorted smile slowly spread across his face. Gott clutched a suspicious bag with a menacing grin, looking toward the entrance. Noticing Yuri, he greeted him and added that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Yuri looked at him with obvious disgust. In response, Gott picked up the pouch and drank the blue liquid from it. The sight was deeply disturbing. He looked like a man completely consumed by addiction. Blue mana seeped from his body like fog, spreading through the air in unnatural waves. Gott turned to Dale and praised him for successfully bringing Yuri here. Laughing to himself, he declared that now he could get even more drugs. After that, he turned his attention back to Yuri and casually stated that he only relied on drugs a little, and asked if there was really anything bad about it. Suddenly, his mana flared violently. Gott drew his sword, madness filling his eyes. He rushed forward, shouting that in the past Yuri had beaten him whenever he felt like it, and now it was finally his turn to pay back all his debts. At the same time, Yuri released his own mana. Clenching his fist, Yuri calmly remarked that it seemed he hadn't hit Gott hard enough. Then he struck. His fist slammed full force into Gott's stomach. The blow was devastating. A blinding flash lit up the entire room. All the windows instantly shattered. A stream of light erupted from the mansion, illuminating the surrounding streets like a miniature sun. Passers-by stared in shock at the estate. Within moments, rumors of the explosion began spreading throughout the city. Later that day, the doors of the medical clinic swung open. Yuri entered, carrying Gott over his shoulder. Ignoring the surprised glances directed at him, he walked straight inside and laid Gott down on the bed. He calmly told the doctor that Gott was addicted to drugs and demanded immediate treatment. From that day on, stories began to spread throughout the empire about how Prince Yuri of Briol personally dragged his drug-addicted childhood friend to the clinic. The story quickly became one of the most talked-about topics in the region. Newspapers eagerly seized the opportunity. Far, far away, on the other side of the continent, Princess Sibylla of the Holy Kingdom sat in the majestic palace, reading a newspaper until her gaze eventually fell on a photograph of Yuri. Opposite her sat the high priest Vold, who explained that he desperately needed to meet Yuri and asked Sybil to arrange their introduction. Sybil slowly lowered the newspaper onto the table. She noticed that she finally understood why he had decided to address her and not her brother. Leaning forward, the high priest stretched out his hands imploringly and, with anticipation in his eyes, declared that the rumors of his love affair with Yuri should not go to waste. Sibylla crossed her arms and apologized. She calmly explained that the rumor was false and merely a cover. The priest looked genuinely shocked. He quickly asked if this was really true. Sybil replied that, regardless of the truth, she would first like to know why he wanted to meet Yuri. The high priest nodded. He reminded her that drugs were spreading rapidly throughout the empire. Picking up the newspaper, he continued explaining. The problem was no longer limited to criminals and dark alleys. Drug use was becoming increasingly popular among the nobility, too. He explained that the biggest problem was that aristocrats rarely visited clinics because too many people watched their every move. Sybil nodded. She understood perfectly well what he meant. The high priest pointed to the article featuring Yuri. He explained that Yuri had publicly saved a friend who was addicted to drugs and looked at the girl with admiration, holding up the newspaper. The priest announced a wonderful opportunity from God. Yuri's actions would help the nobles no longer fear treatment. Sybil smiled faintly, immediately understanding his intentions. Looking directly at him, she asked if he wanted Yuri to advertise addiction treatment clinics. The priest smiled and nodded. The priest asked for information about Yuri's preferences to persuade him, but Sybil shook her head gently and replied that such efforts would not be necessary. A slight blush appeared on her cheeks as she explained that Yuri was not one to worry about empty formalities. She assured him that honesty alone would be enough and promised to arrange a meeting. The high priest fell silent. Studying her closely, he noticed that she had changed. He added that she seemed much more cheerful than she had been in the Holy Kingdom. Sybil tilted her head slightly and asked if this was truly true. A gentle smile appeared on her lips. She replied that everyone became like that after meeting Yuri. She even added that the high priest would probably end up like that too. The priest chuckled and remarked that he would remember those words. After that, Sybil turned to the window. Warm evening sunlight flooded the palace grounds. As she looked out, thoughts of Yuri filled her mind, and she quietly wondered when they would meet again. Meanwhile, far from the Holy Kingdom, Yuri walked through the imperial capital. Dressed in elegant royal attire befitting a prince, he moved confidently through the crowded streets. Jard and Laurent stood silently behind him. The scene shifted to a massive estate that resembled a military camp, with guns and the clang of steel instead of luxury. And in the center of the arena, Prince Ragnar himself was sparring with a subordinate. The two exchanged blows again and again. The subordinate gritted his teeth and tried to move forward. Then Ragnar moved. His sword flashed in a swift, decisive blow. The attack was so fast that the man didn't have time to react. The weapon flew out of his hand. Before he could regain his balance, Ragnar stepped forward and aimed his blade straight at his throat. Realizing his defeat, his subordinate immediately surrendered. The scene overlooked the training field, where Ragnar's men lay exhausted and sweat-soaked on the ground. The prince was surprised they had given up so quickly, but there was no answer. At that moment, a familiar figure entered the training ground. Yuri arrived with Laurent and Jard. After exchanging greetings, Yuri remarked that if he'd known Ragnar was training, he would have arrived later so as not to interrupt him. Ragnar replied that it wasn't a problem. A faint smile appeared on his face as he joked that age was finally catching up with him, and his body was no longer what it once was. The boys stood in shock, asking if all these defeated knights were due to the old man's endurance. After this, Ragnar invited Yuri to go into the garden so that they could sit down and talk in a comfortable environment. The action moved to a peaceful garden with flowers. Ragnar asked Yuri, who was sitting opposite him, with anticipation whether it was true that he had managed to cause quite a stir immediately after arriving in the Empire. Ragnar smiled and noticed that Yuri had sent someone to the clinic. He calmly explained that it was his old friend who had become addicted to drugs. Hearing this, Ragnar rubbed his chin thoughtfully before asking, did Yuri know what kind of drug his friend was taking? The question caught Yuri off guard. At Ragnar's signal, a small bag was placed on the table. He explained that it contained an extremely dangerous new drug that had quickly spread among the young nobility. Opening the bag, Ragnar emptied its contents onto the table and ordered Yuri to examine it carefully, as these were far from ordinary drugs. Several glowing blue crystals rolled across the table. Ragnar added that although the substance is used as a drug, its effects are completely different. Ragnar crushed the crystal into powder and explained that the drug temporarily heightened all 5 of a person's senses, while also increasing their sensitivity to mana. Hearing this, Yuri remembered Gott's mad face and noticed something alarming. Even from the faint smell of powder, his hearing, vision, and perception of mana became sharper. Yuri asked if the drug was used for training. Ragnar replied that was only part of the story, as nobles used it for exams, duels, and sparring. According to Ragnar, this advantage was precisely the reason why the substance became so popular among the young aristocrats of the empire. Listening, Yuri picked up one of the glowing crystals and examined it carefully. After studying it for a moment, he noticed something unusual. He asked if magical stones had been used in its creation. Ragnar nodded immediately. It seemed that magical stones were indeed one of the ingredients. Then Ragnar's expression turned serious. Looking straight into her eyes, he said that this was no ordinary drug manufactured by common criminals. He explained that powerful people had created the substance for a grand scheme, so what was happening was clearly beyond the scope of ordinary crime. Then Ragnar asked Yuri for a favor. He asked that Yuri personally investigate the case. Yuri inquired why Ragnar had chosen him. Ragnar explained that no one knew the extent of drug penetration into the empire, which meant there were very few people left whom he could completely trust. Yuri was one of them. Looking directly at him, Ragnar asked again if he would help. Yuri met his gaze without hesitation and firmly stated that Ragnar could leave this matter to him. Relief immediately appeared on Ragnar's face. He sincerely thanked Yuri. However, as the conversation continued, Yuri noticed something strange. An empty chair stood near the table. Noticing it, Yuri casually asked if another guest was expected. The question visibly stirred Ragnar. For a brief moment, his expression tightened. Although he quickly recovered, Yuri had already noticed this reaction. Ragnar casually replied that he hadn't even noticed the extra chair. Unfortunately, this explanation sounded far from convincing. Soon after, another man entered the garden. The moment Yuri saw her, his eyes widened slightly. It was Katerina. She greeted her uncle politely before turning to Yuri. Addressing him by his formal title, she respectfully greeted the third prince, Briol. As she approached the table, Katerina smiled warmly and remarked that she was glad to see him again. The smile made Yuri clench his jaw. For others, it would have been pleasant, but for him, it reminded him of the betrayal that had destroyed him in his past life, unleashing a wave of disgust. Fortunately, he suppressed it almost instantly. Maintaining a perfect smile, Yuri politely replied that it was a great honor to meet the Empire's precious imperial princess. Soon, servants brought tea and refreshments. The conversation continued, and Katerina praised Yuri, noting his outstanding successes and achievements on the battlefield, of which she had heard so much. Ragnar joined in and wholeheartedly agreed. He noted that Yuri was incredibly brave and always rushed straight to the front lines. Yuri simply replied that he was only doing what was necessary. Katerina smiled softly and told him that he didn't have to always put himself in danger. Yuri immediately disagreed. He stated that these duties had been entrusted to him, and he was simply fulfilling his duty. This answer seemed to surprise Katerina. A slight blush appeared on her cheeks when she admitted that she had never met anyone who spoke like that before. After that, she asked if Yuri intended to participate in the upcoming fencing tournament. As the two of them continued talking, Ragnar quietly excused himself and left them alone. Yuri replied that he had no plans to participate in the competition. Before he could develop his thought, Katerina interrupted him. She informed him that the Emperor himself would personally present the medal to the tournament champion. Trying to appear charming, she asked if Yuri would give her the medal if he won it. The scene moved away from the garden. The sun was already setting towards the horizon. In the golden evening light of the capital, Jard started talking about their previous meeting. Noticing to Yuri that the imperial princess had shown unusual interest in him, he then asked if Yuri had really had no intention of participating in the tournament. Yuri confirmed this. A disappointed Jard called it a missed opportunity and even complimented Katerina's beautiful smile. But Yuri didn't react to his words in any way. Finally, Yuri gave up and told Jard and Laurent to return to the hotel first. The two of them looked surprised, but complied without further questions. While Yuri left alone, they remained where they were, watching as he disappeared into the depths of the darkening alleys. Meanwhile, Yuri wandered the narrow streets alone, his thoughts growing heavier with every step. He mentally cursed Katerina, her request for a medal, and the smiles with which she did it. They disgusted him. Despite his anger, memories surfaced, filling the empty streets around him. Suddenly, Yuri seemed to see Katerina appear behind him. The illusion was so vivid that it seemed real. In this imaginary memory, Katerina lamented that they should have spent this day together. She noticed that he was being stubborn and urged him to stop. The illusion continued. In his thoughts, she reached out and gently touched his face. She quietly admitted that she missed him. Yuri immediately turned away. He declared that she should stop lying. He insisted he would never give in to her words again. Yet behind those thoughts lurked a question he could never fully erase. He wanted to know if every smile she gave him was fake, if every moment they shared was just an act. Yuri grimly admitted that, despite the betrayal, he still truly loved her. This hurt the most, and for a moment, he allowed himself a final farewell to the past. Then his gaze gradually hardened. Step by step, he left these haunting memories behind. Step by step, he moved toward the future. With renewed determination, Yuri declared that none of this mattered anymore. The feelings he carried over from his previous life had to disappear. The scene shifted again. A majestic temple towered beneath a clear blue sky. Yuri entered and was warmly greeted by the high priest Vlad, a middle-aged priest in a red robe who had himself requested this meeting. Vlad sincerely thanked Yuri for his visit. Yuri calmly settled down across from him and replied that it was no problem, while Jard and Laurent stood silently behind him. Jard noted Yuri's deep anxiety yesterday, and Laurent added that he clearly considered action a better option than complete inaction. Meanwhile, Laurent calmly observed Yuri, noting to himself that he always became noticeably more withdrawn as soon as the conversation turned to the imperial princess. Yuri explained that he had come at Sybil's request, noticing that Vlad seemed too worldly for a priest. He laughed heartily and softened his tone, adding that such an attitude worked well in the empire. Yuri casually looked away before returning the conversation to the main topic. He noted that Sybil's letter had already clarified much of the situation. Turning back to Vlad, he asked point-blank what the temple could offer in exchange for his help in advertising the addiction treatment clinic. Vlad smiled. He commented that Yuri wasted no time and got straight to the point. Vlad enthusiastically offered Yuri any amount, citing the temple's wealth. Yuri considered the offer, but replied that he had no particular need for money. Then something seemed to occur to him. Yuri quietly remarked that what he really needed was the temple's friendship. Vlad's expression froze. Clearly surprised, he asked Yuri to repeat his words. With a calm smile, Yuri pressed his hand to his chest and politely asked if Vlad could arrange for him to be baptized. The high priest considered the request seriously. After a moment, he explained that such a title was not granted lightly, as it carried enormous influence among the faithful. However, a moment later, his expression softened again. Smiling, Vlad explained that a prince like Yuri was a special case. Yuri rose and noted that, once this matter was resolved, all that remained was the interview with God's mention. Vlad assured him that the church would prepare everything, and all he needed to do was show up on time. Before Yuri left, Vlad cheerfully asked if he'd like to stay and enjoy the meal. Yuri immediately agreed. The group moved through the monastery corridors. As they walked, Vlad proudly explained that the temple was famous for its food, and that many volunteers regularly helped there. Yuri noted that the volunteers were likely full of bastards and nobles from collateral families looking for profit. Vlad laughed and admitted that there were indeed many such people there. As they approached the doorway, Vlad began to explain that the food was actually being cooked. The door swung open. Yuri froze. His eyes instantly widened. In the kitchen, a huge black knight in dark armor, wearing a white apron, was cooking. Vlad casually explained that this imposing warrior did all the cooking himself. For a moment, Yuri struggled to comprehend what he saw. The Black Knight was among the 10 strongest in the Empire. He was known as the Empire's sharpest spear, a terrifying creature that obeyed only the Emperor and destroyed any enemies it was ordered to eliminate. And yet this same legendary figure was now volunteering, wearing an apron. Later, the Black Knight sat opposite Yuri with a bowl of food on the table between them. After a brief silence, he remarked that he had heard of Prince Yuri of Briel's courage. However, he admitted that he hadn't realized the depth of Yuri's faith. Then he asked if Yuri often visited churches. The moment Yuri heard this question, his gaze sharpened. An opportunity had arisen. A bright and sincere smile immediately lit up his face. Yuri explained that he hadn't originally been a devout believer. However, his views had changed after his experience on the battlefield. He declared that the war had revealed the insignificance of people, strengthening his faith in a higher purpose. Vlad listened attentively to these revelations, standing next to the Black Knight. Yuri added that he had decided to dedicate his modest powers to God. Behind him, Jard looked on in utter disbelief, while Laurent looked reverent, as if he had just experienced a revelation. The Black Knight slowly lowered his spoon onto the table. A sharp sound echoed throughout the room. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. He noticed that Yuri seemed to be just as human as he was. Yuri smiled modestly and noted that he had a long journey ahead of him. The Black Knight approved of this sentiment, adding that he himself constantly felt imperfect, despite serving the king. Yuri immediately recognized a new opportunity. Leaning slightly, he respectfully addressed the Black Knight and offered him, as a believer, the opportunity to participate in advertising the temple clinic. Before Yuri could finish speaking, the answer came. The Black Knight flatly refused. He explained that he could not take any action without receiving an order from the Emperor. Yuri's expression froze. Silently accepting the answer, he noted that he couldn't inconvenience such a kind man. Later, Yuri left the temple under a bright midday sky. Jard followed him before finally asking if Yuri had intended to give up so easily. As he left the temple, Jard noticed that Yuri seemed to be luring the Black Knight away and gathering information about the Emperor. He agreed with his assessment, adding that the knight had proven more loyal than expected. His thoughts were clouded by memories from his past life of the Emperor who had mercilessly crushed Briel. Thinking of him, Yuri couldn't believe the Black Knight's words when he called the ruler kind. Images of blazing battlefields flashed through his mind. He recalled flames consuming everything around him. The memory seemed like a nightmare. However, he quickly pushed these emotions aside. Turning to Jard and Laurent, Yuri ordered them to return and prepare. He told them to dress appropriately because they would soon meet the Emperor himself. That evening, the Imperial Palace shone magnificently under the moonlit sky. its countless windows glowing with a warm light. Inside, the vast banquet hall glittered with golden chandeliers, polished floors, luxurious red carpets, and nobles dressed in elegant attire. The room was filled with the whispers of the guests watching the arrivals. Covering her mouth with her fan, one noblewoman asked if this group was from the Alliance army, to which a man nearby remarked that they looked rather barbaric. He noticed that these loud personalities had arrived from Bruzen and were making noise as usual. He then pointed to the other delegations, identifying the representatives of the Duchy of Klein and ridiculing the guests from Joachim as hicks. The aristocrat merely responded with restrained interest. Soon, however, the atmosphere changed. Representatives of the Holy Kingdom entered the hall, and the guests immediately spotted the heir to the throne among them. Larson walked in the center of the group, dressed in elegant white and gold robes, smiling discreetly, surrounded by his retinue. Nearby, another nobleman commented mockingly that Larson had arrived from the princess's care. Suddenly, the sound of a horn echoed throughout the banquet hall. When the conversation died down, all eyes turned to the entrance. The third Prince of Briol had arrived. Yuri entered in ceremonial attire befitting his status. A dark blue cloak was draped over his shoulders, and an elegant military-style uniform completed the look. A murmur swept through the room as Yuri appeared. Someone confirmed his identity, specifically noting that he did indeed have black hair. From the raised platform, the Emperor watched the scene with a faint smile. He noted that it seemed everyone had finally arrived. The curtains behind him parted, revealing the imperial family. In the center, the Emperor sat languidly on a throne, clad in white and gold robes and crown, while nearby, in a pale gown, sat the princess. Propping his cheek on his hand, the Emperor addressed the assembled people and praised them as the proud heroes of the continent who had defeated the monster of the grassy plains. He stated that the banquet was held to celebrate their achievements. There was silence in the room as his voice echoed throughout the space. The Emperor then invited everyone to have a good time. Yuri maintained a serious expression. Before the celebrations could properly begin, however, the Emperor broached another topic. He remarked that everyone had likely heard about the upcoming tournament. He then announced that he personally intended to present the medal to the champion. Beside him, the imperial princess remained silent. Although her expression remained composed, a trace of anxiety was hidden beneath the mask. The Emperor's smile widened, and he proclaimed that whoever presented this medal to his daughter would receive her as a wife. The entire hall froze in shock. Eyes turned first to the princess, then to the eligible bachelors gathered in the banquet hall. Yuri stared ahead silently. When the meaning of the Emperor's words dawned on him, he muttered quietly in disbelief, and he wondered whether the Emperor really intended to hand over Catherine as if she were some kind of prize.